A lot of this effort together and working with Cam and making sure this happens. Josh?
Well, it's great to see everybody today in person. We've been doing hybrid for a long time, so it's really the first time we've been fully back in person for like 4 years. So it's been great. We've, like John was mentioning, we put a lot of effort into this, and we wanted to make sure that we had a good program for you and not just a rehash of other topics, right? We want to keep moving the ball forward as we try to increase beneficial reuse and maximize dredging in the bay to support a vibrant economy in San Francisco. So hopefully we'll be making some waves here, but knowing that it is Halloween, I did want to start out with my children, because I've seen a lot of pictures of other people's children today in their costumes. Mine are a little bit older now, but my son in 1999 here in his elephant costume, and then my youngest also in the same exact costume made by grandmother in 2013. It was weird because I was looking back at the history of my involvement with Bay Planning Coalition, and it really started around that 1999 range and the advent of the LTMS coming to be, and then in the 2013 range, then you have the full implementation of the LTMS. So it's a neat bookend to all that, and of course the elephant in the room with all of that was that we had a lot of issues with dredging. We had mudlock, we had significant mounding around Alcatraz, and with the LTMS and the step down, it really changed and is what we have as our status quo today, right? Which is great.
There's a witch behind you.
And it's not me, so that's good. In 2014, I was looking at all the old agendas that we had. We have a lot of the same people that are still participating today. John Coleman, myself, Jim McNally, Steve Carroll, Amy Hutzel, etc., right? But hopefully the narrative has been changing over time. And what Will Travis gave during that presentation was his lessons learned and looking towards the future. And he really challenged us at the time because the system had been changing from what it was originally studied for the EIR EIS. And he said if the laws don't make sense at that time, then maybe we should look at changing them, right? How can we adjust to the new state of being? And this was even before, codifying, not necessarily codifying, but at least summarizing in the Sediment for Survival report, right? Which really highlighted the shift change in TSS coming down from the Delta, where we think that the end of the gold rush TSS load finally came through, and of course the advent of sea level rise planning, which all of the original laws and policies didn't really address, right? So now we need, and have kind of highlighted, that we need a lot of sediment just to keep the wetlands in the bay in place as sea level rises, right? And then last year, we had a really good talk from Dr. Bridges, who was then at ERDIC, but now is a professor of practice in resilience and sustainable systems at the University of Georgia College of Engineering. But this was one of his last aspects before he retired from the Army Corps, and coming from the military, they like their bottom line up front, right? And so he was aspecting two things. One, in that we talked about it a few times, of like dredging is the most expensive in the nation, in the U.S., in San Francisco Bay, but he highlighted that there's really little unique to our problems that are not seen across the country. And if we wanted to really change things, then we need to look at the economics of the situation, both costs and benefits. And so he challenges also in a call for action. So there's been a series of calls for action in a number of different things, right? So Dr. Bridges highlighted these things, I thought they were so good that I wanted to reiterate them, right? You know, we need to take action now was the ultimate thing, with incremental changes being not enough at this point. But his words were that we need to go 100% beneficial reuse, right? If we don't have a big target, we're never going to make changes. We're only going to do incremental things. And if you change a nickel on the price of beneficial reuse, it's really not going to be stepwise. So we need to think big. He also highlighted that the federal standard, which is one of the aspects that we always kind of lean back on, is like, well, the federal standard says that it's the least cost alternative, but it also states that it needs to be consistent with sound engineering practices. And so he suggested that if you dispose of dredged material, that is not really consistent with that. Again, organizing our value statement into our program, and then looking at all the different potential options, all the different levers that are at our toolbox disposal will be key, right? Because one size is not going to fit all in the Bay Area, right? So we need to be looking at those things, and hopefully this the agenda for today is going to highlight that, right? We're going to look at a pilot project. We're going to look at different ways to do things. And then, of course, partnership. We can't do anything without partnership, and we have a wide group of folks that are here representing the dredging community on all different facets. And so keeping that partnership going and open dialogue is key. And we need to try new things, and we need to be willing to fail. But without it, there's no innovation. And then his last part there before, again, the need to take action now, was that don't always assume that beneficial reuse is going to be the most expensive. So I thought that those were worth reiterating, and I'd say that, you know, over the last 14 years after LCMS, right, we have been doing a lot of success. So we have been making incremental progress, and I'm hoping that the program today will highlight just exactly what we're trying to do and strive for in the future. We had record beneficial reuse this year at Montezuma, right? There's a lot of different things that are going in the right direction, and I think that the Dredging and Beneficial Reuse Committee itself from Bay Planning Coalition is the right avenue to keep that dialogue going, right? We want networking, we want advocacy,
I'll turn that on.
and education.
Appropriate noise. Yeah.
While we're trying to fix the Halloween noises, for those who are here next week, this will, in its entirety, will be on our website. So if you're taking copious notes, it will be available next week on our website as well.
All the spooky noises.
Plus those. Throw candy at it.
Hmm? Yeah, mine is muted. This one's muted.
Are we good now?
Hello?
Okay.
Wait, let me unmute it.
Okay.
Thank you. Spooky. All right. So the dredging committee, I think, is the right spot for continuing networking, advocacy, and education. We want to look at funding mechanisms. We want to look at the appropriate science to fill knowledge gaps and make policy decisions. And we have a great team, Cameron, myself, Scott Bodensteiner, and Jan Novak. And between us, we've been able to, I think, strive for a lot of good stuff. John, you mentioned it, that this will be his last event as the Dredging Legislation and Policy Subcommittee Chair. So I wanted to say thank you for all the hard work that you've done, and also put a plug out if others are interested, hopefully from industry, or so it's not all just consultants on the committee. That would be great. Reach out to me or Cameron for more information, and Jan too, I guess, because he has a lot of insight.
I know where.
That's right. So we had 3 committee meetings this year: February, April, and July, and of course today with the workshop. And in addition to that, we also have been engaging with the LTMS program managers roughly 3 times a year, engaged in the RMP, looking at the steering committee all the way up through funding, looking at Port of Oakland, engagement on their turning basin, etc. Right? So we're part of the community, and we will be there going forward. Thank you again for all of everyone's help. And then we have a great list of speakers today, but we also had speakers during our committee meetings. And so, Brenda, thank you again for agreeing to be part of the workshop today. Same thing with Javier. You know, we've had a lot of people join and provide different topics, right? And I put the aspect with Kevin Lundy on there. He brought up the potential of allocations. What would that potentially mean, right? And I know it's kind of spooky, and we all move away from that, but it may be something that is another lever that we could potentially look at, right? And then with Maya and Eric in July, they came in looking at wetland adaptation, part of the engagement, and they're looking to BPC as part of that stakeholder process. But, and again, back to the call for action, right? They had 3 different questions, right? Are there ways to think about dredging differently? How could those changes impact you? And what do you see with increased beneficial reuse? What issues, right? And so these are great things that we want to be thinking about. And hopefully the program today will be good for answering some of those and then posing other questions, right? We're always looking to push the envelope. So with that, I'd say thanks for the time to do the introduction, but then now we can transition to the updates from the regulatory side. And we have Javier and Brenda. If you want to come up, or just come up one at a time, it's fine. And then we can get on to work here. You'll have to come around. Yeah, one at a time is probably best.
I can look at you adorably from here.
Sure.
Morning, everyone. As Josh mentioned, we need to beneficially reuse dredge sediment in order to adapt for climate change. But before I go into my regulatory updates, I'm going to start off with it being Halloween with a tale of horror and suspense. So back in the late 1950s, some of you may recall that the Reber Plan came out. And that plan called for filling the entire bay and building a bunch of subdivisions and freeways through there, all for economic benefit. I think we know today that that would have been a disaster. And just thinking about that keeps me up at night. The San Francisco Bay is an internationally renowned hotspot for biodiversity. That plan would have destroyed all that. Luckily, that incentivized action, grassroots action, and put a stop to that. How did they put a stop to that? Now this is going to be terrifying to some of you. Environmental regulation. And what came out of it was BCDC helped to stop fill, along with the Clean Water Act. We started regulating fill in the 70s, and then in 1995, the Regional Water Board put in their basin plan regulations to prevent discharges of fill. All this did was slow down the fill. In the late 90s, we had lost 90% of our wetlands. And along with those wetlands that were lost, we lost habitat for some of these species that occur nowhere else in the world but the San Francisco Bay. So like the Ridgway rail and the salt marsh harvest mouse. Those species became endangered. And then around 2000, we had the Balin's gold come out. And that's where we started to reverse this trend of destruction. However, at that time, sea level rise and climate change wasn't incorporated into those goals, nor were they considered even earlier during the late 50s, 60s when BCDC came around in the 70s. Climate change, sea level rise. Everything was about avoiding fill and avoiding impacts. However, today we know that we can't just avoid impacts. We actually might need to have some impacts in order to build resilience for climate change in order to protect these species. And so right now we sit in this really difficult position for regulators where where we want to protect the resources from the ongoing threats that occurred in the past. At the same time, we need to look forward and figure out how can we adapt our regulations to address climate change. And that could mean allowing more fill in areas that actually impact some of these species in the short term, in the interest of protecting them in the long term. And now I'll go into my regulatory update. So I'm going to focus first on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Navigational Dredging Program. Why is the Water Board doing this? Because 2/3 of all dredging is performed by the Army Corps of Engineers. So we decided we would focus there first with the intent of getting lessons learned and potentially passing on those lessons to other dredgers. Today I'm going to talk about what we call the 50/50 pilot project, which was the Oakland Navigational Channel pilot project that we just completed recently. We're going to talk about the strategic placement project, which is just beginning this year. And then I'm going to talk about navigational maintenance dredging permit, which is coming up for reissuance probably in early 2025. So first, the Oakland Navigational Channel Beneficial Reuse Pilot Project. I'm going to call it 50/50 from now on because that's a mouthful. The Oakland Navigational Dredging Channel, every year, it's between 600 and 800,000 cubic yards from the 2 navigational channels in Oakland. And they're sent to ocean disposal. And that, as Dr. Bridges, I think, would agree, is wasteful. And so we were trying to figure out, well, how could we incentivize? And also, to get to Dr. Bridges' point, it's really about economics and cost. For us to really work with the Corps, the federal standard requires least cost. And so we came up with this idea because ocean disposal, as most of you know, is more expensive than beneficial use. So how could we tip tip the scales? And we thought, well, if we allow the Army Corps, if we're able to allow the Army Corps to put 50% in bay, which at least it stays within the system and doesn't end up in the deep ocean, which does us no benefit at all. If we allow them to do that, in exchange, would they send 50% to beneficial use? And thanks to Brenda and our other LTMS partners in the Army Corps, we were able to work out that we could do that. And the Army Corps had to, I won't go into the contracting and stuff and all that, but they had some things to work out within their process. They probably had more things to work out in their process than the regulatory agencies actually had with our own permits. But we figured it out. And the result was that 450,000 cubic yards went to beneficial reuse. And we call that a victory. Now, some of the lessons learned under the current regime with the LTMS, in order to not trigger allocations, we could only do that maybe once every 3 years, because that 3-year running average that could trigger allocations in the basin plan and that could trigger violations of the day plan would be exceeded. So while it's a victory, it's still not a complete victory. And so we'll have to come back and think about how we might incorporate the 50-50 on a broader scale, and if we can do that. Next, I'm going to talk about strategic shallow water placement pilot project. So the strategic placement project, this is ongoing this year. The Army Corps and the Water Board were the NEPA and CEQA leads respectively. And the idea behind this, you'll see in the map right here, this is just offshore of Eden Landing, which is not far from the Redwood City Harbor. And the idea is to take about 100,000 cubic yards from the Redwood City Harbor dredging and place it just offshore, as you see in this other picture, and allow for natural processes to push that sediment up into the marsh and into the mudflat areas in order to help maintain those areas. And then we're going to monitor this to see how successful it is, and hopefully this will be a success here, but then we can also start some pilot projects on some other parts of the bay so we can show whether this is feasible or not. There were, again, Army Corps contracting fund that they have, and there were a little bit of delays, but we're hoping to get this started later this year, November timeframe. So tomorrow, hopefully.
Get those books out.
I know, I'm putting Julie on the spot there. It's probably not going to be tomorrow, but we can hope for that. Next, I'm going to talk about the maintenance dredging permit. The maintenance dredging permit is coming up in 2025. So we've been doing some of these pilot projects in order to start collecting information, so maybe we can incorporate the 50-50 split into this future Army Corps permit. Maybe we can incorporate some strategic placement into this permit so that we're not boxed in. We've had opportunities this past cycle, thank you, Brenda, of permitting, where we could have done some more beneficial use, but we were hemmed in by the CEQA NEPA analysis as well as our permits. And as some of you know, to do a NEPA CEQA process, it doesn't happen overnight. And so these opportunities come up, we want to do them, but then we only have 2 weeks to figure out how to deal with CEQA and amend our permits, which is just not enough time. So we're trying to think ahead with this maintenance dredging permit with our CEQA NEPA process in order to address some of those considerations. Which brings me to the last piece here. We really want to look at hydraulic dredging. We've heard from Jim McNally multiple times, as well as others, that hydraulic dredging will reduce the costs. And to go back to Dr. Bridgers, we need to look at economics. If we can allow hydraulic dredging, that's an if. We don't know that we can. We have to analyze that in CEQA. If we can allow it some places where we won't have unacceptable take, we won't risk the species, in exchange for sending it to beneficial use, could that pencil out? So we have to look at where it might be feasible. It probably won't be feasible everywhere, but where are the species predominantly? Where are their largest populations? And we're going to start looking at that. And we started collecting some information. An opportunity came up, a silver lining to the pandemic, where the Army Corps was not able to monitor entrainment. So they don't get to a free pass. They still have to monitor something, right? You guys know us regulators don't like giving free passes on things. So we allowed them, in lieu of the entrainment monitoring, to actually start looking at beneficial reuse sites and other sites where they didn't use beneficial reuse, and look at the habitat for the fish species and see whether fish were using them in order to gain some insight into potential benefits of additional beneficial use from hydraulic dredging. And with that, just thank you for your time, and I'll be available for questions. Josh?
Thanks, Javier. And just a reminder for everybody, the QR codes give the agenda as well as the speaker information. And so now I'll have Brenda Gaten give the BCDC perspective.
Super. Good morning, everybody, and thanks to Josh and Javier for setting me up nicely. I'm not going to talk specifically about regulations today. I'm actually going to talk about policy and where BCDC has been and where we're going, and how it might affect sediment management. And I really appreciate putting Will Travis up there. So you can't see the years in this very well from way in the back, but it spans a period of time from 2013 through 2024-25. And BCDC, along with everybody in this room, has been working towards adapting the region for climate change. Back in 2009, I didn't put that up there, BCDC started talking very much in earnest internally about climate change and what it means to the Bay region. And we had a little kerfuffle, took us a couple of years, but by 2013 we got it straightened out and we instituted the first climate change policies actually in the nation. And those climate change policies talk about projects adapting to sea level rise at 2050 to 2100. 2050 is really soon for those of you who are counting. And so we have started there. Those policies are still in the works, and people are still, when they're looking at development around the shoreline, they're looking at how their project might adapt to sea level rise over time, and lots of other things. In 2016, the Commission, after much deliberation and discussion around Bay Adapt and adapting to rising tides, issued a resolution that said we are going to continue to work on climate change, and we have 5 points what we need to move forward. I'm not going to tell you all those 5 points right now because I have 8 minutes. In 2019, we amended the Bay Plan for 2 reasons. One, for environmental justice, and the other for Fill for Habitat. And I'm going to talk about the environmental justice, Fill for Habitat, and the project that we're currently engaged in, which is regional sediment management and looking at wetland adaptation. So of course this is what everybody's dealing with, right? So I don't need to go into this. I know this is an enlightened group. I know you're all aware of sea level rise and probably listened to the news this morning about climate change and the ice melt of the Arctic, which is not good, continues to not be good news. But as everybody in this room thinks, we think differently. We lead the nation in a lot of the different efforts that we do. We come together in a coalition of industry, environment, agencies, and we work together to address problems that are difficult. We don't shy away from them. So I'm going to just briefly breeze through 2.5 years of work on policy issues and get to results. So environmental and social justice policies, this is slightly different than the climate change look, except for when you think about the communities that are affected most by climate change, which are the environmental justice and social justice communities. They're often in low-lying areas adjacent to the Bay, and they have not as many resources as some of the big businesses around the Bay to adjust to climate change. So it's a pretty important piece. One of the things BCDC did, as many state and local agencies did, and federal governments, looked at our own issues around how we supported injustices in the region. And what came out of our policies were a couple of things that the community, the regulated community, needs to address, which is making sure that we have meaningful community involvement when we're looking at major projects in the region. Not just doing the usual, we're doing a scoping meeting for CEQA, we're doing a public comment period for CEQA, and we respond to comments that are done. We're actually looking for meaningful engagement, going into the communities and really helping people understand the impacts and when possible, using partnership as a way of getting to yes on the projects. We also are looking more at the disproportionate impacts to communities that are already overburdened by contaminants. We're looking at ways of improving public access for different community uses. And of course, we continue to use best available science. And lastly, but not least, when we're mitigating for impacts to an area, we need to really think about who benefits from the mitigation and make sure that the communities also get the benefit of mitigation. So those are some of the changes that took place in 2019 for environmental justice, which I will argue is also good climate policy. Fill for Habitat, this is a really fun one. A lot of you all participated in this. There's probably a little bit of misconception about it. So one of the things BCDC did was, you all are maybe familiar with our Bay Plan, that's our guiding policies, and in the very beginning of the Bay Plan, it has a preamble about fill. It talks about fill being bad for the Bay, having negative impacts. Javier explained those negative impacts pretty quickly for me, so thank you. But one of the things that we did in the preamble is we added that fill can be good, particularly when we're looking at climate change and we're looking at adaptation, particularly for habitat. We focused on habitat first because the science is there. We know that wetlands need elevation capital. We know that beaches need elevation capital. They need sediment to survive as the waters rise. So the Bay Plan does now allow more fill for habitat in the Bay. One of the misconceptions that people say is that we have a no net fill policy, and that is not actually true. It's never been true. The law actually says you should have fill that is the minimum necessary for the project. We still work with that, but we look at that with the climate change lens and the knowing we need to adapt to the communities and the habitats in the region. We also included more emphasis on green infrastructures instead of just straight out riprap, because we know there are difficulties for wildlife and shoreline adaptation when you riprap ashore. You interrupt sediment transport, you interrupt habitat, you interrupt what the waves can do while dealing with erosion. So there are other ways to deal with erosion. We're trying to recognize that and move towards more of the green infrastructure that the Coastal Conservancy particularly is championing along with others. As far as our monitoring and adaptive management, we're looking to right size that work so that a big project has appropriate monitoring and a small project has appropriate monitoring. It's pretty important instead of overburdening small projects with too much monitoring. And lastly, encouraging pilot projects, that was an important addition. Previously, it didn't explicitly say go out and try things, figure out how we can adapt to sea level rise. So pilot projects are encouraged throughout the Bay Plan now, both in subtidal and in wetland areas. But they do require monitoring because they are, in fact, experiments, right? So like the strategic placement that Javier mentioned and Julie will talk about in a little bit, the monitoring is necessary to decide whether or not these new innovative techniques actually work. And so that is in there and included. And lastly, we encourage, which we always have through the LTMS, more beneficial use of dredge material and other sediments in projects. So I'm going to move on to the very last bit that we're working on now. So, gosh, I feel like it was 2020, but it might have been 2021. BCDC applied for an EPA Wetlands Development Grant. And the EPA, thankfully, with input from several people in the room, I'm sure, decided that it was a worthy effort to look at how we can improve beneficial reuse of sediment and soils in the region. We had the fabulous report that SFDI put together, and that, again, you guys set me up nicely, that said we need this huge amount of sediment if we hope to have wetlands survive into the future and help us adapt. One of the switches from just thinking about beneficial reuse for wetlands for habitat is really talking about and thinking about beneficial reuse in wetlands as a sea level rise adaptation. It is green infrastructure. It is vitally important to help the communities behind it, the wetlands, the habitats all survive, and without sediment and soils, you can't do that. So it's once again based in scientific knowledge and documentation. We look at more sources than just dredge material. So you all have heard us talk about dredge material forever. It is and remains the most important amount and volume of sediment that we have available. It's frankly the most easily transported. If you think about a scow, it has 5,000 to 6,000 cubic yards of sediment, and it moves quickly and easily across the bay. It does have to be pumped or outfitted off, but 6,000, if I do my math right, is about 600 trucks worth. And so if you think about air emissions, you're also getting that benefit and lack of traffic on your roads when you're using dredge material. It's a really important source, and we will continue to push forward in that area. However, we also recognize that there is dredging that happens in flood protection channels, and that those channels have, in many cases, separated, straightened out waterways that bring sediment into wetlands from the land side, and we're looking and seeking collaboration with the flood protection agencies to think differently about how they move and use their material. And thankfully, with the BAFTA, there is a group of folks there that are willing and interested in this conversation. Lastly, there's also sediment soils from upland construction with the South Bay salt ponds and South Bay shoreline are already pioneering that use. We recognize there's contaminant issues that perhaps we can streamline some of the work that we can do to bring more of that upland soils into areas that they're useful for. So we are in this journey together, and we're once again asking this coalition to join us. We have a couple of workshops that we'll be doing later this year, or no, early next year. This year's almost over, to really lay out a roadmap and help us decide what are the barriers that we are seeking to address. We know what they are. We've been talking to you guys for years. We're familiar. We have a list. And the good news is our lovely consultant team, Catalyst, has been interviewing people, and so far it seems like everybody's in agreement. The list is the list. And so now what we need to do is think about actions, right? And we have a great core group of people. We have Javier, we have Evan, we have Jen, we have Louisa, and we have Nikki with the Bay Planning Coalition on the core team. We have a commissioner working group of 7 engaged commissioners who are interested in thinking about this. And we're looking forward to a Bay Plan amendment between next year and the year after to help us with looking at sediment and soils differently. And then following that, we will be also working on financing, because as Javier said, as we all know, beneficial reuse can be expensive, no matter how we do it. And so we're looking at different ways to improve the region's resiliency, working together. The idea is that everybody in the room has something to contribute. We know that, and we have enjoyed working with this community, and we'll continue to. So that's my talk. I think I'm done. Thank you for listening.
That's all right for now, because the next one will be on the screen, so it might be hard to see otherwise. So, thanks, Brenda, for those insights. And now we'll transition to our speakers on the phone, Eric Saperstein and Roger Cockrell from E&S Resources. So hopefully you guys are out there to talk a little bit about the national perspective.
We are, and thank you. I guess we're not going to be video. Okay, so we'll just do this from the ether of the voice. So thank you, the Bay Planning Coalition, for letting us do this virtually. It was sort of challenging to get out to California this week. Roger and I are delighted to be here. And I think, in the interest of time, let me just sort of respond to sort of the elephant in the room, if you will, no pun intended, about what the dysfunction of DC is like right now and what we expect may happen going forward. I think the best way to sum up where we are in DC, aside from having a new speaker, there were a number of folks that were vying for speaker over the last couple of weeks, actually 3 weeks, and I think they sort of captured the sense of what was going on was one member who decided to name or put a member into nomination to be speaker, was asked why he did that, and the response was, well, I can't stand that member of Congress, I can't think of a worse job than the Speaker of the House, so I'm putting him into nomination. So that's sort of captured where we are in Washington. But it isn't as doom and gloom as it appears. We still are going to have dysfunction. But I think for our purposes in today's presentation, we bring to you some positive updates of what's going on. And I'm going to turn it over to Roger. I assume that Karen has put up our one slide so we can guide our conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Roger to talk about some of these sort of policy activities related to beneficial use and where we are. So Roger, why don't you take it?
Sure. We'll talk about a little bit about beneficial use of dredging material. And first, thank all of y'all that are in the room there that have been working on this issue for many years. We're starting to see some benefits, no pun intended again, of that beneficial use work that y'all have put in out there. We've had some legislative successes, and we're even making headway with the Corps of Engineers. The Chief General Stone put out a philosophy statement on beneficial use of dredge material on January the 25th of this year. And saying that he wanted the Corps to increase their use of beneficial use of dredge material. And they've been working on that since then. And in August 28th, they put out a memorandum that is actually defining the categories of beneficial use. One of the things I think they found in the process of looking at beneficial use within the Corps of Engineers was that some of the stuff that they were considering as beneficial use really wasn't. And so in this memorandum, they categorized 13 overarching categories of dredge material management or placement. And they've created both beneficial use and disposal, which they've always had, and they've created a new category called transitional placement, which is just to stuff that they're moving primarily in a riverine type environment where they're moving the material downstream, but it's not necessarily providing beneficial use. The memorandum is very encouraging in that it is directing robust innovation in the planning and categorization of these dredge materials for beneficial use. And they are also giving the district latitude in determining whether, how the material is described and whether it is disposal or beneficial use placement. So it's encouraging that the headquarters is telling the districts you need to go out and be innovative in making this decision. I had the opportunity to talk with a point of contact for this memorandum, and her name is Kate Skelton, and she said, I was asking her specifically about some of the hang-ups that we've had in the past of beneficial use, particularly cost issues. And she said that the admin section 125 of Order 2020 that encourages more beneficial use, it also talks about incorporating the benefits of beneficial use, that she feels that even though the federal standard is going to remain in place, that how the federal standard is applied will be finessed somewhat to incorporate more of these benefits. And she felt like that the benefits of beneficial use did not necessarily have to be a one-to-one cost. They exist more like other environmental projects in the Corps that show that the benefits of doing beneficial use are prudent for the government to do. Another one of the things that she was talking about that's somewhat innovative is the Corps looking at averaging costs across channels over a couple of 3 years to see if placing materials beneficially was a way to even out those costs and make it in the government's interest as well. So, you know, these are all positive signs coming from headquarters that are trying to make beneficial use a reality, and certainly to fulfill the chief's vision of beneficial use of 70% of the material by 2030. And like I said, headquarters is pushing it down through the chain, and the districts are going to need to push up. And as Mike Connor said in a hearing earlier this summer with the T&I committee, they recognize the core hierarchy of the Secretary's office. They all recognize that there's somewhat of a frozen middle within the core that they've got to break through to get this policy from both sides. So I strongly encourage, you know, everybody there to continue working with the district to be innovative in how they look at beneficial use and how they move this up through the chain, because it sounds like the districts are going to have a lot of latitude in what they do, and there's a lot of opportunities, and it's going to be for the headquarters to say no, not for the districts to decide out of hand that the answer is no. So we're looking forward and think this is all, you know, very positive in the beneficial use arrangement.
And so, Roger, I would also add, as you're thinking about working with the district folks, and I want to emphasize that the frozen middle comment was made in reference to a question, I believe, by Representative Jared Huffman, who sits on the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure, who effectively said, you know, how do we break through the challenges, if you will, of shifting gears and relying more on beneficial use activities? And that was when Assistant Secretary Connor said, look, headquarters level, we get it. We have, I think, Roger Kate also said that, you know, we have younger engineers who are more sensitive to these types of issues. No insult intended to the older generation of engineers, but it was clear that the message of eventually we have to do business differently has finally broken through as a policy from the top and the bottom and from Congress. And I would say that when you look at the August 28th memo that implements the philosophy of General Spellman, to consider this as a process for the process. It is a license, if you will, to work with the Corps of Engineers, as Roger said, at the district level, to position your projects for beneficial use. Roger, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think it's I think Eric's exactly right. This is a great first step that the Corps has come out with in recognizing the dredge disposal categories and giving the districts the ability to categorize their material in their respective river basins and estuaries as to how the material should be categorized and disposed of. So it's a very good first step. There's still work to do with the Corps on this, but yeah, that is a major change, I think, in the way the Corps does business.
And just to put a finer point on it, just to reemphasize what Roger said, this redirection of looking at combining multi-year benefits to help you get through the morass, if you will, of cost versus benefits and what have you is a huge thing. Now, all of this would not have been possible without Big Plan Coalition and others pushing very hard to highlight the need for beneficial use, particularly when we're talking about climate resilience responses and aquatic ecosystem restoration initiatives. But I do want to mention the Bay Area Congressional Delegation support. Part of our success, if not a large part of our success, has been Congress's years and years of pushing for more aggressive beneficial use implementation. And on May 25th, we saw a letter that was written by several members of the Bay delegation, Representative Garamendi, Huffman, Tassone, Lofgren, and Mike Thompson, to the chair and the ranking member of the Energy and Water Development Appropriations Committee in the House. And in that discussion of the letter, they beneficial use needs to be more aggressively implemented. And as a result of that, the committee put together language that essentially tells the Corps of Engineers to redouble their effort and to basically go forward and implement the general's philosophy. And to that point, in this language that is pending in the House of Representatives, well, actually it was voted out of the House of Representatives this past week. Now it's going over to the Senate. In the language, it requests that the Corps provide Congress with a list of beneficial use projects that will meet the guidance directive to hit that 70% by 2030. So I think that from your local perspective, you now have something to point to, work with the district offices to promote projects that could be submitted to Congress for documentation and validation of beneficial use. And I would also quickly add that the program direction that Congress is asking for is to ensure that you have annualized dredging as part of this priority. And that is also, there is similar language in the Senate Energy and Water Appropriations Bill that has not seen Senate floor action yet.
Hey, Eric, can we wrap it up here in the next couple minutes, please?
Yeah, sure. So bottom line, we're in a good position. With respect to Water Resources Development Act of 2022, we have similar language pending before the House and the Senate. The Attorney Coalition put in place language to Senator Padilla to direct under Word of 2022 a reinvigorated commitment to beneficial use projects. And then generally we expect similar language in the House when the House opens up their portal for member requests for their order bill, probably sometime in December this year. But from a congressional outlook perspective, we're going to be doing this into December, probably around the time when Christmas carols are being sung, and we will probably see the appropriations process left unresolved until later in January is the best guess. And then the second session will be all about the Water Resources Development Act of 2022, where we are optimistic that we will see increasingly strong language by Congress to the Corps to, as I said, redouble their efforts to rely on beneficial use of dredging materials. So we will end there. Sorry if we went over. And happy to answer any questions.
That's great stuff. Thank you so much. That does give us a little bit of time for questions. I don't know, Javier and Brenda, if you could maybe come up if you want to. Cameron, do we have a mobile mic at all? Or?
Is there one right below you?
Might be. So we have a few minutes at least for anybody's questions out in the audience. If you have any out and back. The witch and the road.
Yeah, I just had a question for Eric and Roger about, and which are currently on video. The letter from the Bay Area Congressional Delegation. Can you just explain who that went to and what it requested? And anyway, it was hard to hear in the
Were you able to hear it?
I wanted a repeat of that one.
Sure. So very quickly, every year during the appropriations process, the appropriations committees on both the House and Senate ask members of Congress to submit requests that they can consider as part of the spending bill. It's sort of a backdoor way of reinforcing authorizing committees' directives. And so they use the appropriations process to essentially address issues of concern that the Appropriations Committee believes are valid. And so, as I mentioned, Representatives Garamendi, Simpson, Thompson, Huffman, DeSaulnier, and Watford sent this letter to the committee asking them to essentially reinforce the importance of beneficial use of dredged material. And similarly, legislative language was requested and I believe promoted by the late Senator Dianne Feinstein during the consideration of the Senate Appropriations Bill.
Great. Everybody who's in costume is asking questions now. Pink hair, please.
So I just have a question. As we look at the possibility to maybe have hydraulic dredging in some instances, let's say, are we looking at opportunities to streamline how we're looking at that, so that we're not continuing to have this conversation 5-10 years from now about can we do it on expedited CEQA or expedited permitting to make that happen sooner rather than later?
So we're looking to incorporate it into the CEQA for the Army Corps, and that should provide a roadmap potentially for others. So is there going to be like an expedited CEQA process, you know, unless somebody in the legislature or the governor somehow does something? Probably not, but it can expedite it by at least showing you, providing a roadmap for what you need to do in terms of your CEQA analysis. So hopefully we're able to accomplish that in order to, so that we're not reinventing the wheel each time.
I'm just going to add to that, that hydraulic dredging is permittable now. And people forget that. It is permittable now, but you have to get an incidental take permit from Cal Fish and Wildlife, which requires the CEQA document and mitigation. So we do know through studies that hydraulic dredging does entrain fish. And so that does need to be dealt with. And I think, you know, the Army Corps could provide that roadmap, but it is going to be an incidental take permit issue into the future, as long as we have these endangered species. And in case people don't know, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is currently looking at listing longfin smelt, which is one of the 2 species of significant concern with the treatment. So, but there are potential other things. We do have sand mining that takes place hydraulically in the bay. One of the things they did is put fish screens on their intake. So the dredging community might think about techniques to reduce some of the entrainment, which may be different for smaller dredgers than the very large hydraulic dredging that Army Corps uses.
I have a question before we get to others, maybe. It's my privilege sometimes as moderator. I'd like to ask, you know, as we're starting to get sea level rise and the fringes around the bay, some of the areas that we're going to potentially fill, like a Montezuma and a Hamilton, all these places are great, right? But there's going to be impacted areas around the fringes that are going to be then subject to the same inundation. Do you have a different philosophy for how you would either permit or mitigate for areas that might be marginally impacted, that are already part of an ongoing process for cleanup, or, you know, for capping, or would you require dredging in that aspect first before filling? I know it's a multi-pronged theoretical question, but I thought I'd pose it.
I'll take the first one. I'm confused by the second part of the question, so you can think about how to clarify that. So we have been thinking about this concept of large landscape scale wetland restoration that use quite a bit of fill. The Hamilton version, which is, you know, the 5.6 to 7 million cubic yards of material, versus some of these smaller projects. And I know Javier on our core team with others, we've been talking about this in an early sense, but if you think about wetland restoration and sea level rise adaptation and using wetlands as an infrastructure first line of defense, and you think about cities and counties who may need to restore wetlands in their locality for that purpose, you can think about smaller dredging projects going to smaller wetland restoration projects. And you can think about locality, right? So you think about a flood protection channel, you think about a marina, you think about a smaller wetland, and all of a sudden you've got three elements there. You've got the sediment, you've got the water, and you've got a place that needs it that maybe isn't a huge project that takes many, many years, but maybe a couple of seasons to complete. But there are challenges there because having lots of individual projects means coordination, it means funding, it means providing expertise to entities that maybe don't have that expertise and are not used to doing that work. So there are pieces there that need to be developed to support that kind of work. But I think that is something we're very much thinking about as we think about climate adaptation and wetland restoration.
So the second part of the question was a little vague, but I'm going to use my prerogative to interpret it the way I want to. So, you know, there are areas around the bay that are impacted by contamination. And so I'm interpreting it as like, what are we going to do about that in reference to beneficial use? Are we going to require removal first, or are we going to require capping? And you're going to love this answer. It depends. It really depends on the site-specific conditions. There are certain areas that we're working on. I know one restoration site where we capped it, and then we had to figure out a way, well, we being the responsible party, had to propose ways to keep that cap in place so that it wouldn't be eroded eventually over time. So there are measures that are incorporated in that restoration project in order to protect that cap. So that's one approach. Another approach, I know in another site, where they actually went in and dug it all out, and they removed it, and then they filled it back up and did a restoration after that. So it really depends on the situation. It depends on the level of contamination, as well as the extent of contamination, and a lot of it does eventually boil down to costs and the ability to get the work done.
Nice prerogative. And I know we have just about a minute or so left, and there were two questions. I don't remember who was first, but I'll start with you.
Question for Brenda about SB 272 and whether those kind of local scope rise adaptation plans might become an opportunity to have like local jurisdictions, flood control districts, cities, counties articulate the sort of beneficial reuse plans that they truly have, maybe? Or you were talking about the connections between projects at a local level. Is there an opportunity to use that planning process to get them moving forward with ECDCs?
Yeah, so just in case anybody doesn't know what SB Senate Bill 272 was, that was the bill that was just passed, also known as the Laird Bill, that gave ECDC the authority to work with local cities and counties to develop their sea level rise adaptation plan. And it puts, I'm not going to list it all because I'll get it wrong, but it gives a timeline in which the cities and counties need to do that, and it gives BCDC the approval process on those plans. We are in the very early stages of that work. We've been hoping and working towards this for quite a while with the Bay Adapt program that, again, many of you have participated in, the joint platform and other things. I do believe that this is an opportunity as cities and counties look at what are their general needs, what space do they have, where is their accommodation space, that they can also use beneficial reuse in wetlands as part of that adaptation planning. I think it's a really important part of it. You know me, I think sediment's like one of the three legs of the stool that we need to be able to stand up or sit these days. So I believe that will be part of the picture. Thanks for the question.
And was your question quick?
Just say yes and go.
Go.
it's kind of operate on a, to be cute, maybe the just-in-time delivery sort of format, right? It's dredged, it's barged, and it's placed. Has any thought been given to proactively storing, processing, and, modifying the sediment in a way so that it meets some particular geotechnical or habitat need?
The short answer is yes, but I don't think anybody's really come up with a solution there. Army Corps is interested in looking at aquatic transfer facility, and that has its challenges. The Water Board is willing to look into that with the Corps. We're not as excited about it because we think that there's some barriers that there's lower hanging fruit for us to pick, so to speak. With upland use, we are looking at mixing. So we are looking at what happens on the site when you place it and you go with your heavy equipment, your earth movers, and you move it all over the place. That creates a mixing. So we are looking at to see whether that could be used in a risk-based approach to allow for some areas with slightly higher pollutant levels to be placed and mixed with areas with lower pollutant levels, and what does that mean? In terms of dredge materials, I don't think we've gotten as far with that in terms of looking at that, although I will turn it over to Brenda here to talk about how the LTMS does look at that in terms of weighted averages and some other things.
Except for I'm going to use my prerogative and not answer that question. Just kidding. I'm going to try to answer quickly. +1 to what Javier said. So on the dredge material, I think one of the really important things that folks need to recognize is every time you pick it up and move it, you're costing more money, right? So we're trying to do as much direct placement as possible, getting the material where it belongs in one fell swoop, which requires equipment, staffing, and money. We also, in the Bay region, do not have an excess of cheap land to put dredge material or upland soils in a stockpile. It was something the LTMS looked at a long time ago, and as last I checked, property has gotten more expensive since the 90s. But as far as the dredge material and contaminant issue, we have 2 sites right now that are accepting dredge material. Montezuma Wetlands, and I'm happy to see Jim Levine here today, and one of our prime shakers and movers and keeping dredge material going, and Cullinan Ranch. And they both have acceptance criteria. Montezuma has more flexible acceptance criteria, and they have the ability to take foundation or slightly elevated levels of contamination at their site because of the way they built their site. Cullinan Ranch is limited by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's biological opinion. Those numbers are bright line numbers. However, I will report that regularly when we have slight elevations of like a contaminant or two, we work regularly with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Cullinan Ranch to make sure that they really don't want the dredge material there, and chances are they really do want the dredge material there. We've had a number of opportunities where we've had just minor exceedances, and we have gotten material to that site. So I think that sort of answers your question, but as far as the contaminant work, there is more to be done, unfortunately, to change numbers that we currently have, which is on the list.
I wouldn't hold a lot of hope about changing the numbers. Let me just say that, because we tried. We looked at what was called the floating percentile method, and we actually ended up with lower numbers than we currently have. So I really think ambient is going to be about as low as we get, because when you go into risk-based numbers and you go into toxicology, and some of my fellow coworkers know this, the toxicological studies are going to establish very conservative, very low numbers. And so there's not a lot we can do, but through risk-based approaches, we can look at exposure. And that's basically what we're doing with the upland materials. And so we can evaluate exposure and, in a way, without changing the numbers, allow for additional material of potentially higher values. But that's a risk-based approach that we certainly are considering with upland, would be willing to consider with dredge materials.
if we were on Zoom right now, I'd put a little heart next to what Javier just said.
Well, thanks. There's so much we could do with this, and we could really talk for the whole amount, but we have a lot of other great speakers and topics. So I want to say thank you to Javier and to Brenda and to Eric and Roger on the phone. Thank you so much for your time. And now we'll transition to the beneficial reuse site updates, and that'll be moderated by Scott Bodenstein.
Hey, thank you, Josh, and happy Halloween to everybody.
Yes.
Just want to start by saying it's great to see Amy and Christine join Jan and myself in the spirit of dressing up. And if you didn't already know, I'm dressed as merit sand, the yellowish brown deposits that you see unique to the waterways of Alameda Channel, yellowish brown. So I'm excited to be here to introduce the managers of our great current and future beneficial reuse sites that are helping to answer, or helping to meet not only the goals of the LTMS, but the challenge of climate change, which has been talked about a lot already. And you're going to hear about how one man's record haul of dredge material this past year was maybe another man's paucity of dredge material. And because it seems like the momentum for beneficial reusing sediments is greater than it has been in a long time, with innovative funding approaches, innovative contractor equipment applications, and like we just got done hearing about, innovative regulatory considerations. We not only want to hear what's next and what's going on now, but we want to hear what if. What if we could finally reduce that incremental cost of ocean disposal and beneficially reuse every single cubic yard of sediment in the bay. What if Julie's strategic placement project shows that strategic placement is not only effective, but practical and cost effective? And what if we can hydraulically dredge in the bay? What will that mean for how much and how fast we can start beneficially reusing sediments all around the bay? And that's going to be what Jim McNally is going to talk to as we transition from beneficial reuse sites to the dredger's perspective. So to start off the updates for beneficial reuse sites, we're going to start with Steve Carroll from Ducks Unlimited. We talked about Coleman Ranch and a little bit about the always hoped for Sears Point beneficial reuse.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Hit the right button. It's all teed up. Should be. That's not mine.
Cameron.
Should we reorder?
Back there someplace.
Yes.
Reorder.
When did you send yours in?
Last minute.
You want to switch order?
Yeah, for now, if we could, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, take a number.
I will.
So we'll quickly transition to Linda Tong, who will be speaking on behalf of the Coastal Conservancy and give us the latest on where we are with Belmarin Keys. It's long and unexpected.
My name is Linda Tong, and I'm a project manager with the State Coastal Conservancy. And I will be providing a brief update on the Conservancy's work on the Hamilton-Belmar Keys. restoration project. And the Hamilton, Belmar Keys area, together we're calling the Novato Baylands. Just a quick overview. The Hamilton, Belmar Keys Wetland Restoration Project is in Marin County, near the city of Novato, and I'm going to be focusing a bit more on the Belmar Keys Unit 5 property, and that is between the Belmar Keys Community Services District and Novato Creek to the north, and the Hamilton Wetlands to the south. Much of the Novato Baylands area is owned by the state of California under the Coastal Conservancy's management, but we have been partnering with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for the restoration of this approximately 2,500 acre site of historic baylands and lost wetlands. And with this partnership with the Army Corps, the Coastal Conservancy would be paying for 25% of project costs, and the Army Corps would be paying for 75% of the project costs for restoration. You can see here that this site has 3 main parcels. The Hamilton wetlands have been restored already, and now we're focusing on Belmar Keys Unit 5. We are gearing up for planning for restoration on that site. And there is a parcel, the North Antenna Field, that's owned by the State Lands Commission. This is a formerly used defense site that will require cleanup by the federal government before it can be restored. And just to mention that the Hamilton wetlands were about 650 acres, and for Belmar Keys Unit 5 plus the North Antenna Field is nearly 3 times as large as that. So a lot of lessons learned from Hamilton will definitely help us think about how to restore Belmar Keys. As I mentioned, the Hamilton wetlands were restored back in 2014, but there was a long lead period of planning and implementation to get there. The Hamilton Wetland Restoration Project converted the former Army Airfield military base into approximately 650 acres of tidal marsh, seasonal wetlands, and uplands. And now the wetlands are evolving to provide a home for many threatened and endangered species. For restoration of Hamilton, an offloader was required, and the project relied on an offloader that was stationed 5 miles offshore in deep water. It was electrically driven with a power line from Belmar Keys, and sediment was slurried with bay water and pumped to the site through a submerged pipe. And since reaching in 2014, the Conservancy started restoration of Belmar Keys. And in 2021, the Conservancy, with many great partners and consultants, completed construction of phase 1 of the project. Phase 1 included building a new levee that's inland of the existing bayfront levee. It's about a 2-mile long levee and used on-site borrow source. Part of phase 1 was also creating seasonal pond complex and enhancement of additional seasonal wetlands. And last year, the Conservancy Board authorized $20 million for the Conservancy to work with the Corps for phase 2 of the project. This funding will be applied towards the Conservancy's 25% cost share of the total project cost. And so status now and what we're hoping to do in the next year, the Conservancy has been working with ESA to just summarize some updated opportunities and constraints of the site, and we'll be helping to facilitate some design scoping meetings to frame phase 2 restoration. And that would include restoration of the bayward side of the newly constructed levee, so tidal marsh restoration, seasonal wetland restoration, landward side of the new levee, and other valence habitat. And we just this month signed a design agreement with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and we're getting the money in place so that we can work with the Corps to design and implement the rest of Boomerang Key's restoration. In the meantime, the Conservancy is working to maintain the site, needing to monitor and do adaptive management of phase 1 of the project, and knowing that it will take several years to get to implementation, we are also trying to explore the possibility of receiving smaller amounts of sediment in the interim, but this will require regulatory conversations, and we are just starting to think about exploring that possibility. Here is a tentative schedule for phase 2 restoration. This coming year, we have a conceptual level design for the Boomerang Keys site, so we will need to update the scope, evaluate preliminary design, and this would be led by the Corps, but working in close coordination with the Conservancy. Tentatively 2024 to 2026, initiate final design and obtain permits for the work. And 2027 and on, start placing dredge sediment. And sometime in the future, eventual breaching of the bayfront levee. So some considerations we have for phase 2 restoration is, of course, cost and availability of sediment. The site may have the capacity to hold up to 14 million cubic yards of sediment, but given that potentially just about 1 million cubic yards of sediment may be available from dredging projects per year, we definitely want to think about how we can have restoration happen on a faster timeline, especially in the face of sea level rise. So we are aiming to restore the site with a lot less sediment than the maximum capacity. And if we're just recalculating costs from the numbers from the original cost estimates of the project, the current day cost of restoration would exceed the dollar amount that Congress had authorized for this project, and so we, again, aim to make the project work with within a lower dollar limit. Some other opportunities and constraints, definitely continued conversations with regulatory agencies. We've heard a little bit about some interest and also some less interest about the aquatic transfer facility, some opportunities with strategic shallow water placement of sediment, but given that this site is so large and the site elevation would need to be brought up prior to breaching, these are just ideas that we will need to further discuss. So I mentioned, needing to look at restoration scenarios with reduced cost and sediment, and with the Army Corps of Engineers, they are willing to work with us to do some value engineering to achieve habitat goals as intended by the general reevaluation report, but with lower cost and less sediment. So doing review during the design phase to determine the most cost-effective way to restore the site without taking away the original purpose. And of course, needing to learn from Hamilton Wetlands restoration and other restoration sites within the Bay. Again, we're just restarting these discussions and need to get deeper into this issue once the Corps is ready to engage with us now that we have a design agreement in place. With Hamilton, I mentioned that we used an offloader that was 5 miles offshore, and this, of course, is one possibility with Bummer Keys, but having an offloader stationed over many years would be quite cost prohibitive. So what other options do we have? With the phase 1 levee that's been built, that allows for placement of fill material from multiple sources, such as bay dredging, Novato Creek dredging, dredging of the Bummer Keys Lagoon, or upland projects. And we've heard also that we need to think about different placement and transportation methods, such as hydraulic dredging. And with the phase 1 levee, this also could allow trucks to access the site without having to disrupt ongoing land management. And I think we will be hearing more about Cullinan Ranch and some other sites. And so thinking about how these projects can be used to help determine how Bummer Keys will be restored will be part of our discussions with the Corps and other experts. And that is all. Thank you.
Cameron's figuring this out. I wanted to say thank you to Linda, and man, that's so exciting to hear about the design agreement between the Corps and the Conservancy, and actually seeing a schedule laid out on one of those slides.
Put together an excellent venue to bring together the restoration community, the regulatory community, the dredging community, and talk about challenges and opportunities. It's really, really is an exciting and always an informative event. So I appreciate to be here. I've had the privilege to give an update on Cullinan many years in a row, and I was thinking, usually my slide deck and my talk's kind of the same with slightly different numbers, so I thought, what can I do to kind of shift it up a little bit this year? And who I want my target audience to be. And we're permitted, we're moving forward, and the regulators are a proponent, a partner of our project, and really facilitating material to come our way. The same with the funding agencies that are working with us. Coastal Conservancy is really a champion of trying to get dredge material into beneficial use. So that meant that it's the dredging contractor that I really want to talk to. I'll steal my own thunder right now. My intent is to tell you that Cullinan is a worthy site. It's a viable site for us to get material to, and you can bring material to us with the certainty that we'll be able to receive the material without interrupting your primary work, which is the dredging project, right? We're looking for a byproduct of your work, and we can work with you without you having risk of being delayed by our inability to receive and manage material. So that is where I'm going with. And since I told you to finish, I'm going to go with the start. Get the right. Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about Skaggs Island as well, but Cullinan and Skaggs Island are still located in northern San Pablo Bay. They're still part of the San Pablo Bay National Wildlife Refuge. Skaggs Island's about 4,400 acres, Cullinan's 1,500 acres. They're both destined to be tidal wetland restoration sites. Cullinan was 1,200 acres of the west part of Cullinan was restored to tidal wetlands in 2015. That's when we held back about 300 acres and started our efforts to bring in dredge material to that part of the site. This is the beneficiary part of Cullinan. We're looking to import about 4 million cubic yards over this roughly 300 acres and raise elevations by about 6.5 feet. To date, we brought in just under 3 million yards. We're still looking for about 1.1 million yards to finish off the site. The site itself obviously is accessed by the Napa River. You got to go through a couple bridges. We have 2 authorized offloading locations. One's at the confluence of Napa River and Dutchman Slough. It's got more depth, more width. You can bring in larger equipment, but you have to pump about 1.5 miles to 2 miles to our site. The other one spans the breadth of our site along Dutchman Slough. We have had up to 15,000 yard scows in there and work with no problem, but it obviously has more constraints of depth and width, and there's lots of currents at certain tide cycles. But it's a proven technology. We've had a lot of contractors bring us material. We don't have an offloader. The dredging contractor has to set up their own infrastructure. But Manson, Lynn Marine, Camazin, Maryland Dry Docks, Curtin Maritime, a lot of dredgers have come and brought us material successfully. And in fact, most of those dredgers have left their pipe on site. So we're losing track of whose pipe is who. We may have a yard sale at some point. So. This is an image of 2022 when Manson was offloading material at Cullinan Ranch. So the top image is obviously their offloader is located at the Napa River. You can see they're pumping water into the scow and slurring it up, and then the pipeline's heading up Dutchman Slough about 1.5 miles to the site. The lower image is their discharge pipe, and then we have an image of one of the cells. Cullinan has 5 cells. This is one of the cells after the sediment has been placed. 2022 is a pretty wet winter, right? And Manson was working throughout the winter 24/7, brought in about 900,000 cubic yards of material. And it was a lot of lessons learned for us, because usually we had a lot of space. We didn't have to worry about the slurry water that we bring in. We're not like Montezuma, who has a way to recycle the water so they don't wind up with a sheer volume amount. Well, we get about 80% of the import is water, 20% solids, right? So we had like 5 million yards of water coming at us. And with the rain and precipitation we had a lot of trouble managing the water during this winter 2022. But we figured it out. Manson was great to work with. They're flexible. We have the ability to discharge water, and we monitor when we discharge the water. So we had to implement that during the 2022 season. And the monitoring showed that we can almost implement real time. Water would come to a cell, we'd pass it through a couple other cells, and then it would be discharged into the tidal portion of Cullinan Ranch. And dissolved oxygen levels were always way above the minimum requirements. and our turbidity levels were always lower than ambient levels within Cullen Ranch. So that was great news for us. Like I said, we're looking for another 1 million yards, so we feel confident now we have more infrastructure. We brought in a 24-inch pump that's portable that we can use to vacate a cell that we're pumping into. We have equipment now that we put on standby where we can cut weirs into our cells to help vacate that cell so that we can continue to pump that material into it. What we found is we're looking to bring up to an elevation of 6.5. Our internal berms that we constructed are at elevation 8, and then our perimeter levees are at least at elevation 10 and above. And if we can fill our cells up to elevation 8, we lose about 40% volume to shrinkage and compaction. And so if we get up to that elevation 8 with the dredge material, it pretty much settles right down to our design elevation. So we're using that to move the water around. We do have, obviously we lose volume within our site as we fill it up. Right now we still have about 1.6 million yards of total capacity of slurry water and dredge material that we can bring in at any one time, and then with the ability to discharge that water into the tidal portion of Cullinan, we're confident that we can keep the operation moving if it all came in at once like it did during 2022. This slide is a survey of just post-import by Manson. It shows the final need that we have. This obviously adjusted for our 40% loss. But as you can see, the dredgers pretty much filled the eastern portion of the site, which is a shorter pumping distance, and now we have to get the material to the southwestern portion of our site. You can't see the numbers, but the darker the color, the deeper the elevation. So that shows kind of where we have our last bit of need to get to our target elevation. The cells that are on the eastern and the northern side are all at grade, so we're done with those cells for the most part, except for a couple corner spots. That means if you set up at the confluence of Napa River, you got about 1.7 to 2 miles that you're gonna have to pump to put the material there. And if we have a couple valves in there so we can vary our placement location a little bit, we found last year that we can really get these cells filled out pretty flat and uniformly across and get the material off it. So we're pretty excited about and confident that we'll be able to get this done as soon as we get the material to them. And this slide's just to give you an idea of what our final vision is for the site. It's our 60% design plan. I do want to say that we're looking for 1.08 million yards. We do have the capacity to take 1.5 million yards. You can see the channels that we were using to convey our water are kind of oversized for what the restoration needs. So that gives us a little bit of flexibility. If a source site needs to bring off a little bit more, we're able to take it. But really, we're looking for about 1.1 million yards. And then once it comes to restoration, we'll let the material firm up for a couple years. And then we're going to get on it, cut the tidal channels, create some islands, lower the internal burns, and then lower the exterior levees. And we're going to reach the Cullinan Ranch on the west, to Deshman Slough in the north, and then Guadalcanal Village, which is a wetland, existing wetland on the east. In the meantime, we've seen a pretty good response from wildlife. We have saltmarsh harvest mouse that are starting to come into the site. We've had least terns and snowy plovers nesting on the site the last couple of years, so we've had to alter our dredge placement plan a little bit, but it's all been workable around season. So we've got some great successes already starting before we restored the site. And then I think we're going to finish up with Skaggs Island. For the last few years, I've said it's been on hold. Fish and Wildlife hasn't had the staffing capacity due to funding to move it forward. They finally are staffed up, so we are able to move forward with this project. It's about 4,400 acres. Again, it's subsided. It needs about 6 feet of fill. If you take that and you multiply it out, you're looking at 45 million yards. Where that's not going to happen, obviously. But we have just recently received grants from the Coastal Conservancy and the Wildlife Conservation Board that's allowing us to move forward with the design and permitting of Skaggs Island plus some adjacent properties. And we're going to move forward. Our intent is we are open to receiving dredge material. We would love to receive dredge material. But with the reality of Belmering Keys coming online and the need that Montezuma still has, I just can't see us being competitive in that market, especially since you have to go past Belmering Keys in order to get to Skaggs Island, right? So we're not saying no, but we're also designing it with the intent to restore these areas without the important dredge material, but it would obviously help. And maybe if perspectives change, once it's restored, we could use this as another placement. Well, it's already restored. You know, use some bottom scales and just dump the material in there once it's open. So, maybe not. Anyway, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Steve. Coleman Ranch is just a great testament to what contractor innovation and know-how can do to feed into that incremental cost to make beneficial reuse more affordable. So now it's another exciting project, more of an unconventional beneficial reuse of sediments. And Julie Beagle is going to be talking about how she now intends to strategically place sediments in the real near future. Julie?
Hi everyone, thanks for the opportunity. I also love coming to this meeting. I've given this update a couple times, so I think this hopefully will be new. And I just want to reframe a little bit what you said earlier. It's not what if this works, it's like this is an experiment. We're going to try it, we're going to adjust. We know we need all the tools in our toolbox. And so I think we have to kind of open our mind as a community to the experimentation that we need to meet all the needs that we're talking about. So it's not a what if it works, it's a when we do it, then we adapt. Okay, so everyone else did a really good job of setting this up already, but we all kind of just get us on the same page. We have limited sediment supply and sea level rise, and that leads to marsh drowning and habitat loss and also extreme risk for communities. There's really great, can you guys see the slides? I was going to look a little bit. Yeah. Okay. So really great work by the USGS looking out for existing marshes, how long those marshes will keep pace with sea level rise and when they start to downshift to mudflats. And then of course what we know when that happens is we have less room for our endangered species that we have all fought so hard over our careers to protect. And so we're really, as Javier set us up really nicely at the beginning, we're really at this transition point. How are we going to protect these species and these marshes that currently exist? So we need new placements. And I want to kind of separate this type of idea from what Steve was just talking about and Linda, such great opportunities we have to restore our diked valence, which are polders, low-lying. Those need to raise elevations up mechanically. That is 100% what we have to keep doing. At the same time, we also have to be working with our existing marshes because those are what are downshifting now. So it's like the both and that it's not one size fits all. So we need these novel methods. Someone earlier mentioned the Army Corps' Chief's Command philosophy thing that he put out, which is so great. He was talking about 70%, flipping the script from reusing 30% of dredge material core-wide to reusing 70%. And of course, we say here, and Todd Bridges said it last year, that we're really going for 100% or all of the material that we think is possible. But I just like to put this up because I just sort of like some of the language at the bottom. I don't know if you can see it. It says, you will need to leverage available solutions, strategies, and tools. So we know how to do this in a lot of places. We were successful at Hamilton. We're going to keep going, but also applying new approaches and technologies. So that's what I'm talking about and what I feel really excited about. Of course, there are lots of challenges. You all know them really well. That we just heard really explicitly how hard it is to get offloaders into the right place and how long that piping takes. There's this challenge of the timing, when sites come online versus when we have that material, and the kind of challenges around double handling. The federal standard remains, but you heard the discussion about the new 125 policy where we can now cost share that incremental cost if we can show the benefit. So we're working really hard on trying to quantify the benefits of strategic placement. But I want to just kind of hit this home a little bit more. We're trying lots of different strategies here as a whole community. All of you are involved in this. And one way that sort of makes sense to me, and I'm a geomorphologist, that's how I think about the world, is in these categories. One is we've disconnected our watersheds, right? So one set of opportunities, removing those obstructions. We look at the reservoirs, right? How can we notch reservoirs, manage our reservoirs differently to access the sediment that's up there? Can we reconnect creeks to valence? That's removing the obstacle, restoring that physical process. Or even just mechanical breaches when we're removing the obstruction. How can sediment get naturally to where it had gone historically? Phase 2, or second category, is assisting natural processes. So that's where I'm sitting with shallow water placement. We're just giving it a boost. We're trying to get the sediment a little bit closer and let physical processes do the rest of the work. I'll talk a little bit about this idea of geomorphic dredging, or pulse dredging is another one. And then there's replacing natural processes. In places where we've diked baylands, we're not going to restore all the physical processes. That's where we need to mechanically get it there. So that's Belmarin, Keys, Cullinan, places like that. So, there's different categories, and we have to really understand that setting when we're thinking about what types of solutions to go where. Here's another way of looking at that. This is SFEI's work that they're doing for our regional dredge material management plan, trying to help us quantify the benefits of these different settings. So the areas in orange are those diked baylands where we're probably going to mechanically replace that process, and the areas in green, which are much, much less, are the places where we need to focus on maintaining those marshes to keep pace with sea level rise. So I'll zoom down. I'm going to talk about this shallow water strategic placement. I know I've talked about this a lot for the last 2 years since I've been at the Corps, just been hammering this, but here we are. We're probably going to do it in the next 2 weeks. I'm crossing my fingers and I'm checking my email every single day because I cannot tell you enough how many challenges there have been. It's like every single side of the coin is really, really hard, and it's almost not happened several times, and I just, to be honest, will not be surprised if something happens and it doesn't happen, but I'm just, we'll do it, we will do this, but I just really need to hammer that home. You all know this. It's very challenging to do this. Here's a new graphic that we tried to make to show what it is. It's just placing sediment about 1.5 miles offshore of Eden Landing and assisting those physical processes to get the material to the mud flat and to the marsh, or even just in the erodible pool of sediment so that it keeps it in the system and can be resuspended on a high tide or a next storm. I won't go through all of this, but we had a pretty extensive planning process with a wonderful team. The Water Board, the Coastal Conservancy, BCDC, Anchor QEA, all worked together really hard to look at the types of sites where this type of solution might be possible. Just like, so we're saying, no, this can't happen everywhere. It has to happen in a place where waves move shore normal, so they're going to take the material onshore. We don't want it kind of like moving, you want it to kind of go where you want it to go, is kind of the answer. It has to be open to tidal exchange. It'd be good if it was near a federal channel, so we're limiting the type of, the amount of mileage that we're trucking. We were also trying to avoid existing eelgrass and critical species. I actually think there's some real benefit in doing this where there's eelgrass to keep the elevations of eelgrass, available, because eelgrass beds are going to shrink as well with sea level rise. And then also looking at kind of targeting this towards shorelines that have historically less investment for disadvantaged communities. We did a bunch of modeling to try to decide between 2 sites. Both of these sites I think could be really suitable. We tested different volumes, different locations, different times of the year. We wound up choosing Eden Landing because in this modeling effort, that was where kind of the modeling came out the best, but I think there's lots of sites. I want to note that our marshes right now, this is a tool for the future. So our marshes now are at mean high water for the most part. And so the modeling shows that not that much material gets onto the mudflats or marshes. So we're testing this tool for the future when we know that equilibrium between that water surface elevation and marsh elevation starts to shift. But this is what the modeling starts to look like. This is the placement site in red. I'm trying to go fast because I just got a 3-minute mark and I have a long way to go. So here's the project going from the Port of Redwood City up to this placement site. The contract was awarded last week. That's really good. And the notice to proceed is like any day now, and then it will happen right after that. So I'm really hoping that this starts to happen mid-November. It has a final end date of December 31st. So that's one of the challenges too, is that we are in this window, right? Because there's a lot of regulations about when you can place material in the bay because of certain species. And so we were thinking this would happen in June, but because of all the delays, and I'll talk about that, now we're like right up against the window. And so that's another one of those constraints that we're working with in trying to make these kind of innovative things happen. As we speak, the USGS is out monitoring. We have a lot of pre-project monitoring happening. We've done marsh surveys. Susan De La Cruz and her team are out there surveying the benthos under the placement site, because there's a concern about the impact to the benthic species underneath this placement and how that extends towards the marsh. So they're trying to capture the communities now and how those communities will recover. Jessie Lacey and her team are looking at suspended sediments flux between the placement and the marsh, and Karen Thorne and her team are looking at accretion and kind of where that sediment ends up. One thing that we're really excited about is this particle tracking study that we're doing, and so as soon as the placement is complete, we're going to be placing 1,000 kilograms of magnetic coated silt. It's totally safe. It's green and it's magnetic, and so we place it there, and then we're able to track that through a series of magnetic arrays. And this is kind of what we're going to be doing, taking these push cores and trying to find it. This is what some of that. This is just from like 2 days ago, so it's all happening. I just want to say in my last couple minutes, like some of the schedule update and some of the challenges. This is kind of expensive. It's new. We're trying to look for like cost-effective ways of doing things, but we were trying to pile a lot of different elements into the Redwood City contract this year, making the Port of Redwood City very, very sad, because everything has been pushed toward the very end, right? It is like very, very challenging. We're so grateful. The first bid came back, like 2 more minutes. The first bid came back, it was so expensive, we had to make some decisions about what we were gonna focus on in that contract. We went back out, and one thing that I think, so that caused some delays. One thing that's really good that I want everyone to hear is that going back out, involves shallow water scales. It's really, really shallow. I can't tell you the amount of people that have been like, Julie, this is not gonna work. It's never gonna happen. We don't know until we try, right? So this contract went back out, and we attracted a new dredging company from Vancouver who hasn't worked in the Bay, but they've done a lot of work in shallow water for the Corps in Portland and in Washington. And so that's really great, because we're trying to expand the folks that are working, because we know we need new equipment, we need new approaches. So I guess I'll end on a positive note, but I guess I just want to highlight that when all those things happen, we often have to reopen our permits. And so then that causes a whole other thing, because that takes time, and everyone's scrambling, and then the government was going to shut down. And I was like, this project is dead, because I need NIMS to respond to me. So it's like, you all know, you've done this lots of times, but that's why like every day I'm like, this is, it's going to happen, right? Okay. So there, that's my, and I guess the last piece of uncertainty is we have, 5 monitoring teams counting on this. They've hired people, we've paid a lot. So like every piece of delay causes delay and heartache for just everybody. So we need to get out of our own way as a group. We need to make this easier. We need to understand that piloting projects, if we're not building a parking lot, we're piloting something here that we want to get better at. We want to be able to adjust and do it and assess how it went and try it again. So I will skip, I think I've said all these things, but we're doing a novel method. We really don't want ecological impacts. We want to keep the material in the system. We want the sediment to go to the mud flats. We've done a lot of tribal and community engagement in this, which I feel really proud about. Our team, we're developing new monitoring methods. This is a tiny lift. It's a 1 to 2 millimeters on an existing marsh, so we can support this marsh. That's a different type of monitoring than we've done in other places. Completion of a successful contract would make everyone really happy. And we're attracting new members of the dredging industry to the region, so I think that's successful. Testing a new tool. Okay, so I'm going to skip this because it's a whole other idea, but I want to just say out loud that we're going to do this once, and we're going to all have to be like, it worked or it didn't, but here's the idea. We need to figure out 10 sites in the region that are suitable for this type of maintenance. Let's call it a marsh maintenance plan. Our marshes are going to start to drown, so we need to look around the bay and say, where are the other places that we might want to pilot this type of approach or another innovative tool? Think about it like a sprinkler. It's like a golf course sprinkler. And so it's not a lot. It's 100,000 cubic yards. That pales in comparison to what Jim needs, to what Steve needs. But we also need to think about our existing marshes. And let's say we have 6 or 7 sites that we've pre-permitted through the RVMMP, or we've at least put on the table. And we can say every 3 years we cycle through. So every year a piece of that, of our dredging, of our O&M plan goes towards these different sites to pulse material, mimicking the physical process that we know made these marshes and mudflats keep pace with sea level rise. We're gonna need that more and more. We haven't seen it in the Bay yet, but that's where we need to be heading, is that type of innovative tools placed across the Bay where those sites need it. So that's my message. And I'm sorry I went long, but here's thank you to the great team.
Thank you, Julie. Such a great innovative perspective and outlook for what's possible, and creative collaboration between the Corps, the regulatory agencies, and the Port of Brooklyn City.
Sorry, I have extra slides.
Let's get through the first slides here.
There's lots.
So next up is going to be Jim.
Keep going.
Jim Levine.
Keep going.
Sorry.
There you go.
Jim Levine's going to tell us the latest and greatest about Montezuma. You got about 10 to 12 minutes. So.
All right, thank you very much, and I realize you can't read this writing, so I'll talk about it. Well, thanks for inviting me back here. You know, the people at the Bay Planning Coalition and the agencies who are participating, without you guys, none of this would have occurred. When we first came up with these ideas and pioneered creating wetlands with dredge sediment, we did that with Laura Marcus at the Coastal Conservancy. She did that at some of Baylands. We did it here, but we needed the support from the folks here and the regulatory agencies. The state agencies in particular were amazing. And so I just want to say that first up. So I'm going to just give you an update about the project, and then Josh asked me to just talk about how we could incentivize more private investment in doing the things we're talking about today. So our site, we got our final permits in 2001, and I can relate to Julie's saga of what we went through to get to our permits, which was 12 years and 2 lawsuits. Our project is to restore 1,600 acres, a little more than that actually, of historical tidal marsh, where the fresh water meets the salt water, and also rebuild the industrial port of Collinsville, which we own. Since 2003, we've received over 10 million yards. We operate 24/7. We finished phase 1, which has now been restored to the tides, with some extraordinary ecological results. I'll show a little of that. And we provide consistent union jobs and revenues to Solano County. Here's where our site is located in the North Bay. We own 3,200 acres in fee title. And we fortunately paid off all the loans and mortgages which we had to take, which were extraordinary at one point, including personal guarantees, which made my family very nervous. We are right at the confluence of where the Sacramento and the San Joaquin rivers come together and then take a sharp left-hand turn. It's where the fresh water from the rivers meets the salt water from the bay, and it has extraordinary ecological benefits for fish species, where the young fish would come down and nurse. Also because of the sharp left-hand turn, it naturally scoured out that shoreline, and that's why there's an industrial port there, and we have 22 feet of water depth at low tide. We pump sediment, it comes in barges, we pump it. This was phase 1 that we have now restored. We pump it, and then we recycle water into these ponds here, and then we do it again. It's pretty simple to operate, although there's a lot of complicated machinery involved. We have groundwater wells, so we can feed these ponds and operate 365 days of the year, regardless of fish windows. Here's our offloading system. I think many of you have been out there and seen what it is. We use this is about 7,000 horsepower of electric motors. We pull about 3.1 megawatts of PGV power, although when we're going to the ponds closest to us, we're only using about half that power. So it's really, really good. A little update. Thanks to the Army Corps and state agencies, and I have to give a shout out to the Coastal Conservancy. You guys led this effort to really go to DC and make something happen. So Amy, you and your people really did an amazing job. The last 2 years have been great for beneficial reuse. 2022, all that material went to Cullinan, as you heard Steve said. 2023, we won all the contracts, and so we're getting all that material this year, setting new operational records for us. We're also working on bringing construction soils to our site. We're working with 2 Bay Area ports and a couple other companies trying to make that happen, to maybe deliver another 200,000 to 400,000 yards of construction soils. And I think you'll see that happen within the next several months. And I'll talk about the extraordinary results we've had with ecological recovery. We have an extraordinary operations team. Our people, the guy who runs our site, offloaded our first load in 2003. He's here today still. This just gives you an idea. We offloaded 24 barges over a 72-hour period last week. And we've been doing this for like 3.5 months now. So what it requires is, and you can see the range of projects we took in just 3 days: Port of Oakland, MAGRAD, Chevron, and then of course we took about 8 other projects this summer. This was our phase 1 area. We designed it and built ponds in the shape outlining where the future channels would go, so they were basically voids. And then you can see the location where we had planned and then effectively breached the site in 2020. We now, and thank you again to the regulatory agencies, we saw that we were going to be accepting sediment a lot faster than we thought this last year, so the agencies worked overtime and got us full authorization to move into phase 2 of our site, which has got a capacity of about 15 million yards and about 1,000 acres. So, and it's right on the river. This will have extraordinary ecological values when it's restored. We're now working in pond 14 North and 14 South, and we're building another pond, 14 North and pond 15 can take foundation sediment. So we always have to spend money ahead of the next season, basically, to get the ponds ready. This is a photograph from when we breached the site in October, 8 a.m. October at low tide, October 27th. Extraordinary what happened that day. We had a herd of elk move in just that day. And now looking back, we've had tidal channels developing with no incision into the foundation sediment, which is buried 3 to 5 feet below the surface. We've met all our water quality criteria. Vegetation is developing actually faster than was expected. And we've seen the return of special status species, including fish, to the site, salt marsh harvest mice. It's been really extraordinary. If you look at this, you can see we've taken photos of the same area over 3 years. And you could kind of see the extraordinary vegetative cover that's developed. This all occurred without any planting. We have the authority to use weed removal, including herbicides if we need it. We've only had to do that occasionally. This is a vegetation map. Extraordinary. We use drones, obviously, to survey these. You can see new channels forming into the wetland. It's like what happened thousands of years ago, naturally, and we're seeing it today. Extraordinary bird use since we took over. And so I only have a little time. So what does the future hold? We believe our site will be a critical site in the recovery of endangered fish species. It's where the young fish nurse so they can survive in the bay. And you know, with a lot of luck and some extraordinary work by our consultants and our team, we got the elevations right and the hydrodynamics correct, and it's working out amazingly. We've got about 15 million more yards, and about, depending on how fast it comes, 20 more years of operating life, and then I guess I have to get a real job. And then we own the offloader that's used on our side. It was used in Hamilton. We own it, so it will be available. It is available to use on these other sites. It's the most amazing equipment that works in this field. I'm really happy I was able to buy that at an auction. Josh asked me to spend a minute just talking about how to incentivize additional private investment. We rely on federal money. We need more state money involved. The state, and I mentioned that to people we know in the state last week, the state needs to step up. Other states do it. Bay Planning is the leader in organizing that effort. In kind of looking at how this might work, how do you get more private investment involved? So if you're talking about non-philanthropic investment, so there are people who donate money because they want to do good things, and we do that also. But if you want non-philanthropic, big money, okay, what do companies look for? They look for some kind of financial return, or some kind of return. So either project revenues from mitigation banking or sediment disposal. We get ours from sediment disposal. You can protect other land and facilities that have economic value. So if you build wetlands outside of SFO, maybe it'll protect the runways, so they have an economic value in doing stuff like that. Maybe the agencies would be willing to accelerate permits if you bundle the project, a wetland project and another project, and they both had minimal impacts. Maybe you would get acceleration of permits there. That's a benefit. Maybe we could craft new tax credits. So let me talk about tax credits a minute. The recent core policy places an economic value on created wetlands, and fortunately our site has been able to demonstrate that value. Extraordinary numbers if you calculate it on what wetlands are really worth. Now, private investment could accelerate those economic values. And when you accelerate a value, that's worth dollars. So it may be possible, there's no mechanism here today to do that, but it may be possible to craft new tax credits where private investment could accelerate these environmental values, and you could get tax credits for accelerating. Because if the wetland's going to occur in 2050, but you made it happen in 2030, that's 20 additional years of those values. That's worth money. Maybe it could be worth some tax credits in order to do that. Last thing I'll say is that I get a lot of credit, but really it's the people on our team. People on this team have been with the team for 20 plus years. You probably know many of them. We have a technical review team led by SFEI. It's an extraordinary opportunity to get impartial, objective views from all the stakeholders, including regulatory agencies. That's been going on for 20 years. And I have to give a shout out to the Port of Oakland, who was really our project sponsor in the beginning. Without them, this never would have happened. State and federal agency staff at the time, they came to hearings at 11 p.m. at Solano County, who, when I first went there, said, "You must be crazy if you think this project's going to work." And so the agencies really stepped up. The Bay Area dredging contractors, we've worked with a lot of them now. We've never had a legal or a claim issue with any of them. Everybody has been amazing to work with. And so I have to give a shout out to them. And I always have to recognize Bill Bagley, who was a moderate Republican, icon in California politics, who really behind the scenes helped me meet all the people I needed to meet to get this done. And then lastly, I just want to also mention Mark Reisner, who passed away. Mark was an incredible visionary, and he was the first environmentalist to support our project that made all the difference for us. He was the only environmentalist to support it at first, when others were suing us. Now, people have apologized to us and said, "Wow, you really did a great job, and there are no problems." But that wasn't, Ellen remembers, that wasn't the way it was when we first started this. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Jim. Fantastic progress and even better ideas. So we're gonna hold off questions for our beneficial reuse site managers until after Jim McNally gives his dredging perspective on the what if concept. What if we can hydraulically dredge whenever and wherever we want to beneficially reset it. So Jim, if you are here, right?
Should be online.
Oh, Jim's online? Okay, I didn't know that. Oh, that's right, I did know that. Okay, Jim, take it away. And
you'll have to move the slides for him.
Jim, the floor is yours.
Scott, yeah, Scott.
So have we got the first slide up?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great.
schedule. This will be relatively brief. I got about 10 slides. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the potential for hydraulic dredging and how that might be a path to more beneficial reuse. So if you go to the next slide, Steve probably already showed this one. It's a shot of Culinary Ranch in 2022 with the unloader set up there. So I just, being a dredging guy, I gotta have a dredging picture. Go to the next slide, please. Should be the outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk just for reference to make sure everybody understands what the federal standard is. I was going to talk just briefly about what the federal standard is and my view on the paths for more beneficial reuse in San Francisco Bay. I'm also going to talk a little bit about methods that might make it more likely to get beneficial reuse. And those are changes in the way that the dredging is done. This is where we talk about hydraulic dredging. And then lastly, we'll talk about the need for better communication on the cost of various options. Next slide is another gratuitous equipment shop. That's the unloader on Steve's job there at Ducks. Next slide is about the federal standard. So this should be the 5th slide. Are we on track there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, I'm not going to read this slide, but I'll read the bottom part of what it means. And the idea is a project is justified on its navigational benefits. And so when Congress appropriates funds, they're out of a navigation pot. And that navigation, the cost out of that navigation pot is based on a base plan. That base plan is federal standard. And the idea is that any additional cost for alternative disposal or placement schemes needs to be covered, used to be by whoever wanted it. Now, through 125, it's cost share. So the fundamental idea is this is what the navigation project can pay for. It's the lowest cost, environmentally acceptable. And if you want to do something else with it, that's fine, but whatever that benefit is needs to justify the additional funding and come with the funds. Although since 125, now the Corps is willing to cost share those funds. So, to me, it's a perfectly rational standard, and I think if you start to think about it, this goes away. It is a bit of a Pandora's box in that if the underlying justification for the job is navigation, you can end up with a whole lot less navigation happening with a limited navigation pot if lots of money gets diverted to incremental cost beneficial reuse. Next slide, please. So I'm talking here about the paths to more beneficial reuse in San Francisco Bay federal O&M. And this is specific to federal O&M. The situation is different for state projects. But for federal O&M, to me, there's 3 paths. Either funding that increment over the federal standard with either a separate federal funding source, a la Hamilton. Hamilton's a good example of a environmental restoration funding stream that paid for that increment, or cost share by a non-federal source. That's, to me, the simplest and best path to more beneficial reuse. The second would be allowing alternative methods that get the dredging done cheaper than the federal standard. So beneficially reusing in ways that are cheaper than the federal standard. And I list 3 there. One is mechanically dredging to a holding basin. Is hydraulically dredged annually, directly placed material upland. This is something that gets done in other parts of the country. It works. It decouples the clamshell dredging from the hydraulic dredging, which is much more equipment intensive and much higher production. So this ends up being a much lower unit cost overall. The second option listed there is direct cutter suction dredging from the dredge area to the upland site. I arbitrarily put in less than 5 miles there. And that's a pretty reasonable number. I mean, it's certainly possible to go much longer, but in terms of sort of the typical project, typical equipment, less than 5 miles would be a limit. And that happens routinely in the Sacramento-Stockton area, which I think was mentioned earlier in the conversation today. The last is hopper dredging with pump out to a spill barge or mud flats or directly upland. So hopper dredges, you know, certainly all the industry hopper dredges can pump out. And that's could be a very low cost way to get material delivered upland. Or in particular with hopper dredges to the mud flats. The third method, if you're not going to fund the increment and we're not going to change the methods to get under the federal standard, the third option is to try to regulate methods of reuse. And that would be, you know, closing, you know, other alternatives, closing the disposal alternatives. And to me, that one's a dead end. It's only the lawyers were enough. Next slide, please. So this should be our 7th slide. It should be a nav chart. It shows a theoretical aquatic transfer facility. So what this shows is a 1,000-foot radius pit dug to -40 within the economical pumping distance of a cutter dredge around the Belmarine Keys. And the access channel to it is a 20-foot deep, let's see, 120-foot wide, I think. Yeah, 120-foot wide, 20-foot deep channel. So to initially do this would be 5.5 million yards directly pumped by cutter suction dredge into Belmarine Keys. And then every year, 2 million yards would get placed by all of the local, or at least the northern end of the bay. All of that work would go by bottom dump into the pit at the roughly, you know, SF11 price of $10 a yard. And then once a year at the end of the season, or whenever it's most advantageous from an environmental standpoint, the hydraulic dredge would be mobilized for a couple of months to clear that rehandling basin out and deliver that 2 million yards to Belmarine Keys. So in this case, if you just, and I took this off of something old maybe, but if Belmarine Keys is going to be 13.5 million yards, you could do 5.5 in the initial setup, building the infrastructure for the aquatic transfer facility, and then you got 4 more years of 2 million yards a year of all the bigger, including all the private jobs, could dump in that rehandling basin, and over 5 years you would deliver 13.5 million yards at effectively the DOTS price. Because if you in the big picture, it's about $10 to dump it in there, and about $10 to pump it out. So all of that could be competitive with federal standards and cheaper, frankly. Next slide. This will be, I skipped the cutter to direct pump. There's not a lot of situations where cutter direct pump could apply. Maybe Redwood City. But this is a hopper pumping out option. So you could very easily pump through a spill barge to mud flats and get out of the channels, you know, get a couple thousand feet out of the channels or up to a mile out of the deep water that the hopper dredge would need, 15 feet or more, and you could pump with a spill barge. So this picture on the top right is a spill barge pumping in South San Diego Bay to build eelgrass habitat to -4, and pumping out with hopper dredges to do something like this could be a very economical way to deliver material to mud flats. Hopper dredges would have a little bit more trouble going long distance all the way into the rehandles into the marshes, because they would require boosters, which would probably make them not competitive with the federal standard. But just pumping a mile or so for a still barge certainly could be. Next slide, please. This one is just a plug for better communication on the cost of alternatives. The industry, the dredging contractors are perfectly willing to engage together or individually with the Corps and others to talk about the cost of options, provided we're not talking about that at the, with an impending solicitation. But just in general about the program, we certainly can talk about it in great detail with the Corps, and I think everybody would be better off if they were not surprised at bid day, or understand how much could be saved by various methods. None of this stuff is innovative. None of this stuff is difficult. It gets done all over the country. We put together our loaders all the time. We operate all different types of dredges. There's nothing magic about dumping in shallow water. It all gets done other places. And we're certainly willing to engage and talk about what could be done cost effectively and what isn't. An example, and Julie won't love this, but we'll talk a little bit about the strategic placement pilot bid results. This was the Redwood City bid. It bid twice. The job was changed in between, but the shallow water habitat option wasn't. And in that case, the government estimate on the first bid was $10.25 a yard, when the bids came in at $27 and $90 a yard. The second bid, the government estimate more than tripled to $32 a yard, and the bids came in at $34, $42, and $46 a yard. So it doesn't do anybody any good to do a lot of work on an option and then be that surprised by what the cost of what you're asking for. So we would strongly suggest more engagement with industry ahead of these alternatives getting too far downstream. I think that is the end of my slides, and hopefully I help us get back on schedule. Next slide, please. Just got questions. It's got my favorite picture.
That is a cool picture, Jim. You did kind of catch us back up, but we still got some work to do. So if anybody has again, thank you to Jim McNally for. If anybody, maybe time for one question. I think I've got a question myself. So if anybody in the audience has a question for any of the previous beneficial reuse speakers or Jim, let me know. Otherwise, I can go into, okay, no hands. I'm going to go into a transition between beneficial reuse and what Jan is going to moderate the funding perspective for getting beneficial reuse done by asking, I'm going to ask Jim. Jim Levine mentioned some discussion with the state about funding, and when the Climate Action Plan was passed a couple years ago, I felt like some of the aspects of that would be perfect for funding the incremental cost of beneficial reuse or some other aspect of beneficial reuse. So my question, Jim, to you would be, when you're talking to the state about funding of your project or other projects or dredging in general, does the Climate Adaptation Act and all the funding that is available through that ever come up?
Well, we never talked to the state about funding our project, but as you may know, there's a climate resilience bond that people are putting together for 2024, and we've been engaged. Barry Council, that's the forum I lead to engage in that. The legislators are very interested in that, and so I think there might be some opportunities for putting that in there.
Chris?
Yeah, actually, Scott,
go ahead.
Jim, I have a question. Maybe Amy will mention the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority, but which has been doing a lot of great work with our $12 a year property tax assessment, which I think everyone's happy to give to align to the program. But one of the recent grants that the Restoration Authority, SFBRA, gave to Montezuma was a great one. It really helps accelerate what Jim is doing at Montezuma. And at a recent meeting, it was my understanding that maybe, Jim, that was going to help reduce the tipping charge to maybe make it like equivalent.
Exactly. And
that's at $10 a cubic yard.
So we received 2 grants from SFBRA, $1.6 million to help us with actually restoring phase 1, and then a second grant to provide up to $7 a yard to allow us to reduce our tipping fee to compete with Ocean. And we haven't used that money yet. We didn't need to use it this year, and maybe in next year or the year after we would use it. But that was very welcome, and the Restoration Authority is doing a great job, and we appreciate their partnership on this.
Great, thank you, Jim, thank you all. Okay, so to wrap things up for today, Jan Novak is going to moderate the funding perspective on beneficial reuse. So Jan, take it away.
Thank you. Good, we're still in the morning hours. Okay, everybody's been sitting a long time, so I'm gonna give you a chance to stretch by answering a survey. How many people like to quote movies? Raise your hand. High, raise them high. Not that many. Okay, that's disappointing. All right, why did I bring that up? Well, there's a lot of talent here in the room. So we heard from a lot of people. Javier has been at the regional board for a long time. He talked about the need to protect the Bay. And we need passionate regulators to make sure that the Bay, which is an amazing worldwide recognized natural resource, stays clean and beautiful. And we all love the Bay, and that's why a lot of us live here. We've heard from Julie Beagle, who's had multiple roles, about the technical difficulties of moving these projects forward, et cetera, et cetera. And so there are a lot of talented people here in the room. I had a point to this, and the point was that with talent, usually you need to make a lot of mistakes. You need to grow to improve your talent, and with that comes age. And so as I find myself quoting movies more and more, I find that fewer and fewer people understand what I'm actually talking about, because the movies that I really like are a little older now. So my segment here, there's really a good movie quote that is, "Show me the money." Show me the money, right? Does anybody recognize that? Second chance. Okay, all right. A little bit better. Great. So we're going to start with with a wonderful witch of the West, Amy Hutzel, who's going to show us how to make a magic potion on the local level and state level to bring in more funding.
Thank you.
Amy Hutzel is also the executive officer of the California State Coastal Conservancy and has been doing great work for a long time.
Yeah, that's my second job. Thank you. Yeah, and this is the most comfortable hat I've ever worn, which is scaring me a little bit. But before I dive into talking about the money at the regional, state, federal level, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Senator Feinstein, who, as we all know, passed away recently, and just the amazing legacy she left in San Francisco Bay. I mean, her environmental work, the Mojave Desert, Lake Tahoe, San Francisco Bay. I mean, I cried when I heard that she had passed away, which I don't think I've ever cried about an elected official passing away. And just thinking about what she's done, and also a little bit of worry about what the future holds without her. I mean, she supported the passage of Measure AA, putting that on the ballot and making sure that it passed by well over 70% of the voters in the Bay Area. She negotiated the acquisition of the South Bay salt ponds from Cargill. I mean, she called the president of Cargill in Minnesota and made that acquisition a reality. And most recently, she worked with Congresswoman Spear, Congressman Huffman, and others to authorize US EPA's San Francisco Bay Geographic Program. That was just a couple years ago that was authorized, and it increased EPA funding for San Francisco Bay by 10 times the amount, from $5 million a year to $50 million in this past year. So I just really want to thank Senator Feinstein for all she did. And with that, I will move to talking about some of the sources of funding. So first off, Measure AA, so the $12 per parcel tax that passed in 2016. It's 20 years of that parcel tax. We started funding projects in 2017, 2018, so we're about 6 years into the funding of projects. And we can support with Measure AA restoration projects that involve beneficial use of dredge sediment. So restoration projects partnering with delivery of sediment can apply for Measure AA funding. And projects are evaluated based on the restoration benefits and the associated flood management, flood risk management, and public access benefits. And we're very interested in projects that serve economically disadvantaged communities and include workforce development. So I think the tie-in with beneficial use and dredging can be a really strong component of a Measure AA application. With all that said, the RFP for this year just closed, but we'll have another RFP for projects next year. And Jessica Davenport is out there and really manages all things Restoration Authority, so feel free to talk to her about Measure AA. And as was already noted, I think Ellen noted this, we have provided Montezuma with 2 Measure AA grants, a $2.1 million grant for that incremental cost, reducing the tipping fee, and a $1.61 million grant to breach the levee for phase 1. And so it was great to see the results of that phase 1 restoration and all the benefits for species. On the state funding side, the Coastal Conservancy, we've been appropriated about $1 billion in the past 2 fiscal years, which is just incredible, and that was part of the governor's climate resilience package. 555 million of that is for sea level rise adaptation, and a portion of that funding is greenhouse gas reduction funds through CARB. Another 326 million is for coastal resilience more broadly, so that could include work in watersheds. It can actually include statewide trails. It's kind of a broader category than the sea level rise adaptation. And then the rest of the money is for very specific projects or geographies. So, specific legislative priorities, things like the Santa Ana River Parkway. And we have a rolling pre-application process. So it's open. We did a webinar about a month ago talking about this. We are accepting pre-applications. Moira McInnesby is out there. She's our Bay Area program manager, and you can talk to her about Coastal Conservancy funding for projects. Again, it's I don't think looking to the Conservancy or the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority to just provide funding to cover the incremental cost of dredge sediment without it being tied to restoration projects is we're not super inclined to do that. We are looking at what are the benefits in terms of shoreline resilience, flood risk management, habitat restoration from this work. And then finally, on the federal funding side, oh, and I did just want to also, sorry, on the state funding side, we did put $6 million, or just under $6 million, towards beneficial use of Redwood City Harbor material. I'm not sure what the latest is on that, but that was a line item. Mullen, when he was in the legislature, secured that funding, and we entered into an MOU with the Corps of Engineers to pay the incremental cost for Redwood City Harbor beneficial use. Okay, and now on the federal funding side, we are looking at every single pathway possible with the Corps of Engineers to make beneficial use happen. And sometimes when you're doing that, it looks confusing because it's like, well, if you do this, then why do you need to do that? It's because every single thing, every single pathway could fall off a cliff at any moment. So we're going down every pathway simultaneously and hoping one of them actually leads to projects and beneficial use. The Section 1122 Proposal, Brenda Gaden and I worked on that like 5 or 6 years ago. That has really paid off, and I want to thank everybody who played a role in that. We had a huge coalition of supporters. I mean, the ports, Ducks Unlimited, Montezuma. Feel like I'm leaving lots of people out. The Water Board, BCDC. We had a lot of support for that proposal. It was a $51 million proposal for direct placement and for the strategic aquatic placement. We then fought the good fight with the Corps to make sure they didn't drop most of the project, which was the direct placement, and we won, which was terrific. The strategic aquatic placement is a part of that. It's 100% federally funded, and I think most of the money for the strategic aquatic placement has come from ERDC and from funding that existed for research and development. The remainder of the $51 million, we've been seeking appropriations, and the Corps of Engineers included $19 million in the Infrastructure Act work plan a year or so ago. So the Corps of Engineers got a huge amount of money through the Infrastructure Act. They've been doing a series of work plans to describe how they're spending that money. Our Section 1122 ended up on their Excel spreadsheet for $19 million, and the Corps, that is why material this year is going to beneficial use. One of the reasons that a lot of the material is going to beneficial use. And I think the Corps is spending about half that money this dredge season, and the other half they'll spend next dredge season. And obviously there's still a difference between 19 million and 51 million, so we are going to seek federal funding to get us all the way up to the 51 million. And it's not going to solve this in the very long term, but I think the most important thing with this is we are making it happen this year, because we can always keep talking about 5 years or 10 years off. We got to make things happen like in the short term and show we can do it. We've also been working on a CAP 204 study for Cullinan, and continuing to work to support getting material to Cullinan and get that final 1 million cubic yards and finish up Cullinan. And then Belmer and Keys, as Linda talked about, we want to get that online. We put $20 million of state funding towards Belmer and Keys already. Our board authorized it. That came out of that climate package I was talking about. So we entered into the design agreement with the Corps. That was a big milestone. And we're going to be working with the Corps on figuring out how exactly to get the material to Belmer and Keys. What are the best strategies? I appreciated Jim McNally's thoughts on that. We are seeking, the Corps does have some federal funds for Belmer and Keys in this next fiscal year. If Congress ever actually pulls together a budget, we are hoping to see $1.8 million for Belmer and Keys. That's in the Senate bill already, so it's not in the House bill. But we'll see what happens with continuing resolutions and actually getting to a final budget this year. One other thing I just wanted to mention, going back to that EPA funding, we're also seeking another $54.5 million for EPA for the San Francisco Bay Geographic Program that's this next fiscal year. And that's the dollar amount in the Senate budget. I think in the House bill, it's more like 20-something million, which is not bad either, but we'd like to get that up to the 54 million. And I think that's about it on the funding front. Thank you all.
Thank you, Amy. Next we have we always like to bring in some new speakers, some new perspectives. Next we have Jennifer Armstrong, who started out at the Army Corps of Engineers and has gone a long way since then. So she's a little bit, her bio is not as easy to digest and memorize, so I'm going to read a little bit out loud. As Director of Government Relations at Waterways Council, Inc., Jen Armstrong advocates for the modern national system of inland waterways infrastructure and ports. Prior to joining WCI, she was Director of Navigation Policy and Legislation at the American Association of Port Authorities. Jen is a subject matter expert in congressional appropriations and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works Program. What we at BPC really liked about Jen is she put together a very nice article about how the Army Corps could be more efficient in their contracting mechanisms and how that could help our project. So she's going to tell us a little bit about how the sausage is made, and hopefully everybody learns a little bit of something.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I want to start by thanking Amy for bringing up Dianne Feinstein. So in a previous life, I was on Senate Energy and Water, and of course, as many of you know, she was the chairwoman and ranking member for many, many years. And I must say, over those 7 years, I don't think she'll get the full credit for everything that she did for the people of California. But beyond that, on a personal level, she was an amazing person. She was kind, and she got to know all the staff, even those on the other side of the aisle. So thank you for recognizing her. I think her death came at an unfortunate time, 2 days before the shutdown, that it didn't get the recognition because of all of the headlines that were going on at the time on Capitol Hill. So thank you for bringing her up. She was pretty amazing. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Jen Armstrong. I'm the Director of Government Relations with Waterways Council. But I'm here to kind of put on an old hat of mine. As he mentioned, I was with the Senate Appropriations Committee on Energy and Water, and I was the subject matter for the water resources accounts. That includes the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation. And prior to that, I was with the Corps for 12 years. So over the last 20 years, I've had the opportunity to see the Corps funding challenges from various vantage points. And today I wanted to share with you a little of the history and some of the things that stand out to me from those encounters. But before I dive right into the background and the history, I want to mention a couple of things about the Corps of Engineers Civil Works mission that's very unique, because these things set them apart from other organizations in a number of important ways that I think are important to acknowledge when you have a discussion about the challenges with the Corps, whether it be their contracting processes or how they receive funding or how they execute those funds. The Corps is incredibly complex, as many of you know. As non-federal stakeholders or sponsors, you kind of understand the challenges of having to cost share with an agency that, whose funding is unpredictable, whose schedule can be unpredictable, whose, lexicon can be hard to understand, whose acronyms are endless. But they have a lot of things that make their jobs hard, the complexity of the work being one of them. There isn't always a book on how to do what they do. They also face a lot of public interest and scrutiny, for better or for worse. There's not a lot of government, there are some, but there are not a lot of government agencies that really touch you so personally. When your house floods, that's pretty personal. So you have a lot of public scrutiny that they kind of have to face. You have a lot of statutory requirements that they also have to comply with, NEPA, and coordination with other resource agencies whose timeline and responsiveness is sometimes beyond their control, but has a major impact on their ability to execute in a timely manner. How they're funded is probably the most significant and one of the things that I kind of want to expound upon. But a couple other challenges and things that make them unique is they're a Department of Defense agency, kind of an independent agency that for a large part isn't really known what they do even within the DoD community. So you have military leadership over a civilian organization, which can have great benefits for the mentality and the leadership types and those types of things, but you also have commanders or generals that are coming in and out every 3 years, and with their own set of ideas of what could be done better. And so you have this challenges with that. But then you also have congressional interest. And congressional interest for the same reason that you have the public interest, but the members of Congress, this is one of the few opportunities that they have, and they can do something that they can take back to their district or back to their state and say, this is what I did that impacts your life, whether it be a shore protection project or beneficial use for environmental restoration, or whether that be flood control or water supply, hydropower. It is one of those unique agencies in that you have a heightened sense of interest from congressional members. And what that leads to, a lot of those parochial interests leads to significant policy changes that may be driven by something that originates on one particular project or a very specific issue. And those policy changes can lead to to some inefficiencies, or they can lead to positive changes. But I think a lot of how the Corps got to where they are was really a consequence of a series of things that happened to them over time. And that's kind of the perspective I want to talk to you about. Kind of starting 20 years back, I think one of the most significant things that happened to the Corps was they started to get recognized as they were reprogramming funding. So for those, you pretty much know how the Corps gets their funding. It's on an annual project-by-project basis. 20 years ago, the Corps was able to move money between those projects with a little more flexibility than they have now. Now they have greater reprogramming restrictions. And those kind of came from this leadership really in the House, had experience with the military construction mission, and they kind of applied that way of thinking to looking at what the Corps was doing. And the MILCON mission is funded very different. There's more transparency, there's more of an out-year funding plan, there's more understanding of what is needed from year to year. That isn't really exactly there with the Corps Civil Works program. So when they viewed the Corps Civil Works program from that lens, it appeared as though the Corps was misusing or overusing their reprogramming. And so they imparted some greater restrictions. What that meant was that the Corps was not able to use what's called continuing contract authority very effectively, because prior to having those restrictions, if, let's say, they had a project that all of a sudden needed more money and they had another project that, for whatever reason, delays, contract awards, didn't need the money, they could easily move that money and have that continuing contract authority where they didn't have to award as many base plus option contracts. And really, those base plus option contracts create some uncertainty for the contractors, for non-core sponsors like many of yourselves, and other things as well. Then you have earmarks that have kind of come in and come out. Prior to 2010, they were doing earmarks. In 2011, they had a moratorium on earmarks. They have since brought those back. The last 2 fiscal years, they've had what is not referred to as earmark. It's referred to community project funding in the House or congressionally directed spending in the Senate. It's effectively the same thing as earmarks, but with some more controls put in place to ensure there's more transparency, and that those funds are going to authorized, federally appropriate purposes. But that return and the abolishment and then the return has kind of created a lot of changes in how the appropriation process works. When you had the moratorium on earmarks, you had the appropriators providing these pots of money that the administration would determine how that money got spent in what's called a work plan. So really it was shifting the responsibility of Congress to determine what projects receive those funds to the agency. But it wasn't really the agency, it's really OMB on behalf of the administration, and that created some issues because that wasn't always a transparent process, at least from the outside looking in, on how did they rack and stack these? Why did this project get funding over that project? What are the specific budget metrics that apply? And so there was an interest after about 10 years of that moratorium to make a return of earmarks, and the last 2 years is a reflection of that. And what we've seen is those funding pots starting to decrease or go away entirely, creating some other additional issues, right? The work plan requirements themselves. Typically, a work plan that allocates all the additional funding in an appropriations bill is required from the agency within 45 to 60 days after enactment of that act. So if you have a situation, which is pretty common in the last 10 years, I think we've had 50 continuing resolutions. When that bill gets enacted in that various fiscal years, your funding needs can change or evolve depending on a number of things that have happened. And so when you have to allocate all of the funding up front and you don't know what changes are to come for the remainder of the fiscal year, you're going to have to reprogram, for the most part, any money off of that work plan project to other things. And that is, in and of itself, can be a bureaucratic process taking months, sometimes even longer, and that creates, of course, problems as far as being able to really quickly address funding needs as they come up. And then there's other policy changes that are trying to improve the Corps' efficiency that sometimes backfires. WRDA 14 was the first time in 7 years. Prior to that, it was 2007, that they got a WRDA bill enacted. WRDA is intended to be biennial, every 2 years. They've returned to that since 2014, but between 2007 and 2014, there was no WRDA bill. So there were a significant number of policy changes to improve the Corps' efficiency that were enacted as part of that 2014 legislation. One of those was the 3x3x3 process. And that was with the goal of getting core studies, which were taking a decade, costing a lot of money, were sitting on the shelf. They were trying to get a process in place where those studies could be accomplished in 3 years for $3 million and require 3 levels of core oversight, the district division, and of course headquarters and administration beyond that. Some of the challenges that we've seen come out of that, now that we're almost 10 years into it, is that the design maturity of feasibility studies. Before there was some more modeling, there was some more design that went into the feasibility recommendation than there are now. And it's a risk-informed decision to delay some of that investigation until the PED phase, until they do the planning, engineering, and design. The consequence of that is that you can have significant cost changes between what you knew during the feasibility phase and these additional details that are now delayed. And so you are seeing cost overruns beyond just what is attributable to inflation or COVID-related impacts and other things that we've seen. There is an association with the level of maturity in that design that we are seeing kind of a discrepancy between what was authorized cost and what the new costs are. I mentioned the return of earmarks having a big impact, but also as Congress evolves, similar to what I was saying with military leadership, as Congress evolves, you get a reversal of some policies because changes in membership or, philosophy happens over the course of that time, and policy changes can take years to implement, develop, and get rooted into core culture. And when you have such a quick reversal, even though a decade may not seem like a quick reversal, it can have impacts on how quickly you can associate the root cause of some of those problems back to some of the policy changes and then the reversal of those. So what are the consequences that these changes had on overall and how the Corps is funded? Well, there's the uncertainty to the non-federal sponsor. Most non-federal sponsors, depending on the project, must provide usually 35% of the total project costs. That can be very difficult for a non-federal sponsor whose budget timeframe, they have to be accountable to a town council, a state legislator, whoever that they receive their funding through. Their timeline doesn't always align with the uncertain federal timeframe, particularly when you are having so many continuing resolutions, when it's unclear at what point during a fiscal year will a bill get enacted, and will you miss that opportunity to get your required cost share during that time. That presents a significant number of challenges for the non-federal sponsor. Then you have the uncertainty to the industry. The industry, particularly when we're talking about what we are here with dredging, they need to plan their equipment, where their equipment's gonna be from one place to the next, what it's gonna cost to get it there, when they plan to mobilize or demobilize, their rate of efficiency. And that's really unpredictable when you don't know if there's going to be these options potentially awarded as a part of a contract that you've been awarded. So they built in contingencies into their costs. They make assumptions to address those risks when they make bids, or when they're explaining to the Corps what is the schedule to get this accomplished. They factor in those uncertainties in the form of contingencies. And then you have like the cost, delaying these costs and not performing them on a efficient basis. It's not only the fact that the costs are going to increase, it's the fact that you're delaying the benefits that these projects will provide once they're complete or operational. In the case of navigation projects, this could be hundreds of millions of dollars, and if you were in total across the whole program, you're talking about billions and billions of dollars of annual benefits that are not being realized because these projects are taking so long. And then, of course, because we're spending so much time on these projects, new projects that get authorized as a part of every 2-year WRDA bills, those get delayed because there's limited federal resources. So what is the solution? If you were to ask me what the solution should be, my first reaction is multi-year funding. But that is somewhat fantastical answer because the reality of making that happen is a lot more complicated. Especially now that you have some critics who would say that, well, the infrastructure bill provided upfront funding for these. Isn't that your proof that the solution of providing multi-year funding is still seeing challenges, and completing those projects with that funding is still seeing challenges? So, the challenges and the problems weren't created by one group, and it will take a collective to find an effective solution. You have to get the various levels of the Corps and the administration, including O&B, on board whatever approach it is, but most importantly, you have to get the appropriators, and all of them talking together. It was a series of things and changes that kind of brought us to where we are, and I don't see that reprogramming restrictions would go away. I don't see that they're going to carte blanche bring continuing contract authorities back. But I think that somewhere in the gray areas between, there's an opportunity to look at a reset of, well, how can we more effectively use the funding, the limited funding that we have, to create cost savings, to stretch those dollars further. Beneficial reuse, of course, is one of those opportunities that needs to be looked at from this larger holistic picture, because a lot of those reuse benefits are obviously secondary to some other work that's being done. So the consideration of that as a whole needs to be looked at. But what I can say is that how funding currently is being planned, budgeted, and appropriated is not working for the large-scale nature of work that the Corps performs, particularly as we see restrictions continue to grow, or we can see how the flexibility that they have restrained even further. So I do think that getting the right people together, getting the right message out, and that starts with folks like you, is really where this you're gonna find the solution. So thank you again for having me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity. And thanks again, Amy.
Thank you very much, Jen. Lastly, we have a global perspective on funding restoration work, which is brought to us by Molly Caldwell from the World Resource Institute. Molly is an associate in the Sustainable Finance Center, where her work focuses on deploying domestic and international finance for climate action. In this role, she provides research and programmatic support to projects focused on supporting access to climate finance for public institutions in developing countries. Thank you very much, Molly. Take it away.
Hey everyone, nice to meet you all. I'm coming obviously from a pretty different perspective, so I hope some of what I say will be useful to you all, if not interesting. So I think we can start with my slides. Yeah, so I'll be talking a little bit today about the global landscape when it comes to adaptation and resilience funding. We can go to the first slide. So there's two buckets of funding, and when we're talking about this from a global perspective, we think about it both as the nature-based solutions funding and then adaptation and resilience funding, which is a much larger bucket and includes a lot of different activities in developing countries. So it's not just about funding restoration work, but also focuses on vulnerability and resilience for at-risk populations. And when we look at the broad landscape for adaptation and resilience funding on both adaptation and resilience funding and the nature-based solutions funding buckets, both are greatly underfunded in this landscape. So if you look at the chart on the right, you can see a estimate from the United Nations Development Program. In developing countries, needs for adaptation are estimated at 140 to 300 billion annually by 2030 and definitely by 2050. Of course, these estimates also depend on how we meet our climate goals on the mitigation side. So those costs interplay with different temperature scenarios and how much adaptation funding is deployed up front. But this slide just gives you a quick visual of the needs and this discrepancy between the needs and what is committed, let alone deployed currently. And then we can go to the next slide. And then the second bucket of funding that overlaps but isn't totally included in adaptation and resilience funding is nature-based solutions funding. This funding also comes from different biodiversity acts under different global law. So again, it's a little different than adaptation and resilience funding, which often comes from development funding specifically. So nature-based solutions and that kind of funding can be more broad and look at biodiversity and purely nature focused projects, whereas adaptation and resilience funding always has some sort of people component. But nature-based solutions are also chronically underfunded. The State of Finance for Nature report estimates that finance flows to nature-based solutions are currently worth USD 154 billion per year. However, these would need to more than double by 2025 to USD 384 billion and more than triple to 484 billion by 2030. To keep climate change to, and this is to help meet our temperature goals. So again, these actually interplay a little bit with the mitigation goals. And those numbers are needed to meet the 1.5 degrees temperature goal. Also to halt biodiversity loss and achieve land degradation neutrality. And the report observed that financing for marine protection faces an even greater gap. And yeah, that all of these goals are currently underfunded and not receiving the funding that they need. And next we can go to the next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about the solutions to these funding problems, although these are not comprehensive. Instead, I'm going to deep dive into some specific project structure examples, which I think might be more relevant for this audience. But in the restoration space, in the nature-based solution space, as it relates to climate finance and adaptation and resilience funding, it's a complicated patchwork of different funds. Some under the UNFCCC, which is the Paris Agreement and related funding, some not, some related to development funding, and then also some funding related to the new biodiversity financing goals. But the picture on the left shows you a little bit about the patchwork of different funds, and that's a map that the World Resources Institute has put together. And I'll deep dive a little bit into one specific project in Cuba that is being funded by the Green Climate Fund, which In the international landscape is the largest concessional funding source for adaptation and resilience funding. And again, the projects often overlap with our nature-based solutions goals. And these sort of projects, the ones that I'm going to explain on the next slide, are probably the most common in the international landscape. That's in part because these sectors, adaptation, resilience, nature-based solutions, are the most common to require concessional forms of finance, most likely to need grant-based funding, and the most likely to work with governments. So we see in the broader climate finance landscape other mitigation projects like energy and transport, oftentimes having a lot more private financing and a lot more co-financing and being able to leverage a lot more financing than the projects in this sector. But we can move to the next slide to talk a little bit about the example in Cuba. So this is an example of a project that was put forward to the Green Climate Fund and approved. The project received $44 million in grant-based funding. Not all of the funding in the project is just from the GCF, about $20 million is, and the rest is co-financing from the Cuban government. Again, in the international landscape, it's a little bit different in terms of the percentages coming from outside and that are then leveraged within the country, just because of the needs of developing countries. But Cuba is, in this project, Cuba is frequently affected by tropical storms. It's highly vulnerable to extreme weather events due to its long coastlines. 57% of the country's population lives in coastal municipalities, which are highly vulnerable to flooding caused by intense storms and rising sea levels. And the project aims to increase the climate resilience of over 1.3 million vulnerable people living in the target coastal communities by employing an ecosystem-based adaptation approach, restoring mangroves, swamp forests, grass swamps, to then improve the health of seagrass beds and coral reefs. And the project also included a training component for 60% of the population in those target municipalities. But the chart in this slide shows you how the project was structured. So the funds flow from the project was put forward to the Green Climate Fund by UNDP and with the government of Cuba. It was then approved for funding. The GCF then flows the funds to UNDP, who then deploys the funding to national entities and contractors who execute the work. And there was some co-financing from different local government entities. But this is the most traditional. I'll talk a little bit more about some innovative projects that are happening at the international level, but this is the most traditional form for these ecosystem-based projects, just again because there isn't a clear, it's a public good, there isn't a clear private benefit to doing this work, at least not an immediate benefit that provides a financial return. So funding is going to come from public sources. And then we can go to the next slide and I'll talk a little bit about some of the more innovative forms of finance in the international landscape. So there's a lot of talk at the international level about the need for blended finance. Again, I'm sure at the domestic as well. But this is a little bit about how in an international context these projects are structured. So there's private capital, there's development funding that's coming from international donors. And they're put into a blended finance structure. They'll either have different, there's a lot of different structures that can be deployed. So grant funding can be used to design the fund, do the feasibility studies, and then private funding will come in to actually fund the project. Or it can be public funding that's being used for a technical assistance facility that's done alongside a debt and equity structure. Or international funders are likely to offer guarantees for if the project falls through, they'll be the first to lose their money. And so that's another way that public funding leverages private finance. And I'll talk a little bit about one specific blended finance structure example in the next slide. So this project is an example of why private finance can be difficult to raise for these kinds of purposes. In this example, private capital will not come in until the very end of the project when they will pay for ecosystem services, namely water, after the government has spent around $300 million to provide the natural infrastructure that will facilitate usable water. This works in the long term, but again, relies on public finance in the short term. So the project that you're looking at and the structure is for a project in Peru. The original problem was a water crisis due to natural events such as drought, forest fires, floods, and landslides in Peru that had a large financing gap. There was a lack of pipeline development for water security projects, a lack of capacity on the government side to design, implement, and coordinate natural infrastructure projects. So a TA facility was developed, that included supporting government agencies to coordinate on natural infrastructure projects, sharing information on possible interventions and recommendations from the overseas OECD, and then unlocking funding earmarked for natural infrastructure and helping agencies use these frameworks to support nature-based solutions. So the project mobilized over $300 million for natural infrastructure projects from the public sector. And then again, donors came in to provide the technical assistance facility, the government provided funding. And then mining companies in particular were the ones who were going to use the water resources. So at the end of the project, they now pay for any of the services that have resulted from the project. So that's one way to involve private finance, but it doesn't come until the end. And this is pretty common, especially in developing countries, where again, the risk is high in terms of the project actually being executed. So public finance will often take on the risk first. And we can go to my last example. For a common structure that also is found in developing countries. So again, because these kinds of projects require a lot of public finance, even to crowd in private finance, something that's really important is creating additional, if the funds can't be raised, and they often can't through things like taxes, where in countries that don't have good tax structures, one way to create more fiscal space is to reduce your debt. So debt for nature swaps, debt for climate swaps are becoming increasingly popular in developing countries. They were popular in the 1980s and 1990s during a lot of debt crises, but they're gaining interest again today as developing countries face increasingly unsustainable debt levels, partly as a result of COVID, mounting climate impacts, et cetera. And again, because public finance is so critical in the space, this is the way to get more fiscal space for the government by refinancing public finance, including from private finance. There are different types of debt for climate swaps. Some involve only the public creditor and debtor, while others include a third-party intermediary, which we'll see an example of on the last slide. And so, yeah, one such structure, or one example, is in Belize. Belize worked with the Nature Conservancy. In 2021, they signed a large debt for nature swap with the help of the Nature Conservancy, again, coming in mostly to provide the technical assistance around structuring the deal. But under the agreement, TNC helped Belize access a $364 million blue loan, which the country used to buy back its entire stock of external commercial debt, worth around $553 million at a discounted price of 55 cents per dollar. The debt was trading at this deep discount due to concern over Belize's ability to pay, given an economic downturn. So then this debt conversion or the exchange of 553 million in debt for the loan left Belize with 189 million in reduced debt and lower annual payments. And then with this result in savings, they agreed to, per their agreement with the Nature Conservancy, spend about $4 million per year until 2041 on marine conservation, and to take a variety of different actions related to protecting marine areas. So that is, and again, another innovative structure that increases it, by reducing their commercial debt, they were able to increase public finance available to do some of these projects. And that concludes my presentation. But again, this is a different background for your workshop. So hope some of this is at least useful, and feel free to reach out with any questions.
Thank you, Molly. I'm going to do a lightning round of questions. I'm going to start with Molly. What one thing would help move your projects forward the fastest? If you could change one thing.
Sorry, what was the question?
If you could change one thing about your job to move your projects forward, or one thing, what would move your projects forward the fastest if you could make one change to the way your projects function?
Yeah, so again, one of the greatest difficulties, I think there's two things for projects, especially
you can only
in
have one.
country. Sorry, I think there's two things, especially for projects of this nature in developing countries. One is the level of risk or perceived risk from the private sector to get involved in these projects. Again, the cost of capital in developing countries is so much higher than in the US that interest rates from private funders are incredibly high. So if there was a better way or facilities to reduce the perceived risk and to thus reduce interest rates, that would help a lot in getting more private funding to be a part more of the early stages of the project. So that's one thing. And then, better capturing, the second thing is for these projects, no matter the context, better capturing the actual cost of natural resources for the private sector would also is critically important.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, John Coleman isn't here, but he always wraps up on time. So we have 15 seconds to thank you very, very much for coming. Thank you to Scott, especially to Josh for putting this all together. And we wish you a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Everyone.
Yes, I did.